Welcome back to the channel. Today we are exploring one of the most disturbing ranger accounts ever submitted from the Alaskan wilderness. What you are about to hear happened during the summer of 2018 in Wrangell St. Elias National Park. I am your narrator, and I spent 3 years compiling this story from official records, ranger testimonies, and entries that were never meant to become public. What unfolds across 6 chapters is a record of how a Park Service protocol broke down, how fear spreads faster than any warning system, and what happens when the most powerful predators in North America decide that humans are no longer off limits. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into American folklore and wilderness horror. Like this video and leave a comment below with the name of your city and your local time. We read every single one. Now settle in. The Rangers from Wrangell St. Elias learned something that summer that changed them forever. My name is James Smith. I have been a backcountry ranger with the National Park Service for 11 years. When people hear that, they imagine solitude, clean air, the satisfaction of protecting the last wild places in America. They are not entirely wrong, but that image comes with an addendum that nobody discusses in the recruitment videos. It comes with the understanding that you are perpetually outnumbered in the places you protect. You are a caretaker of territory that belongs to creatures with no respect for your badges or protocols or regulations. I was 34 years old in June of 2018. I had worked Wrangell St. Elias for 5 seasons. The park is staggering in its scale. It encompasses 13.5 million acres of wilderness. To visualize that, imagine a space larger than the state of Massachusetts, dominated by peaks that rival the Himalayas, glaciers that move like frozen rivers, and forests so dense and untouched that human GPS readings can be off by several hundred meters. The park sees roughly 10,000 visitors per year. Most of them stick to guided tours or the narrow corridors designated for casual hiking. I was stationed at the Nabsna district, which monitored the northern section. My jurisdiction covered territories that few people had ever laid eyes upon. The summer of 2018 began without incident. We had a normal staffing level. I was working with 7 other rangers across our section. There was Emily Johnson, the district supervisor, 48 years old, meticulous in her record-keeping, uncompromising in her enforcement of park regulations. There was Michael Williams, a stocky man in his mid-40s with 15 years of experience and a pessimistic view of wildlife management that I had come to respect. Jessica Garcia was our youngest ranger aside from myself, only 31, energetic and idealistic, the kind of ranger who still believed that education and proper camping practice could prevent all conflicts. We also had Robert Wilson as our backcountry specialist, a man in his late 40s who practically lived in the high country. Amanda Clark ran our visitor center and community outreach. William Rodriguez was the equipment manager and maintenance coordinator. Ashley Martinez handled emergency dispatch and radio communications. We were a small team, but we were competent and we understood the parks we served. The problem started not with an incident but with reports. A hiking group came off the trail in the second week of June. They were not injured, not attacked, not even directly endangered. But their description of what they had witnessed was detailed and disturbing. They had been backpacking in the lower Nabsna Valley, an area popular with visitors seeking moderate elevation and reasonable trail conditions. Late in the day, as they were setting up camp, one of the group members, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, noticed movement in the tree line about 200 meters from their camp. She described it as bipedal. She said it moved with purpose. It did not run or flee when it noticed her. It simply observed. The group evacuated their camp within 30 minutes and hiked out by headlamp, finishing their exit at 11 o'clock at night on poorly marked terrain. Emily Johnson took the report. She filed it in the standard format. Possible bear sighting, likely misidentification, visitor education needed regarding proper camp setup and distance from tree-protected areas. I saw the report because it came across the shared roster. This is how bureaucracies work. Information enters the system. It is processed. It is categorized. It is filed. It almost never produces immediate action unless it rises to a certain threshold of emergency. I did not think about it much until 10 days later. On the 24th of June, a solo hiker named David Pierce did not emerge from the wilderness at the designated exit point. Pierce was experienced. He had permits for an 8-day loop through the glaciated regions in the northwestern section of the park. When he missed his exit date by 3 days, his emergency contact notified the Park Service. Emily activated our search protocols. What followed was a week of intensive searching. We mobilized resources. The state police sent teams. We coordinated with local volunteer groups and other park staff. We used aircraft. We covered 700 square kilometers of terrain. We found no trace of David Pierce except for his abandoned campsite, located 8 kilometers from any trail, situated in a small clearing surrounded by spruce forest. The campsite told a strange story. His tent was intact but standing open. His sleeping bag lay on the ground outside the tent, pulled from within. His backpack was overturned. His food supplies were scattered, but not consumed. There were no signs of animal predation. There were no drag marks or blood. There was simply the appearance of hasty abandonment. We found his body 3 days later. He was located in a ravine, 2.5 kilometers from the campsite, in a location that would have been nearly impossible to reach accidentally. He had been dead for at least 5 days. There were injuries consistent with a severe fall, but his body rested at the bottom of a ravine with sides too steep for any natural tumble to carry him there. It appeared that he had been placed. Emily ruled it a hiking accident. The official report cited a disorienting hike, poor decision-making at an altitude of 2,000 meters, and a tragically fatal mistake. We filed the paperwork. We moved forward. We did not mention the campsite that appeared evacuated in haste, or the body positioned in a location that required intentional transport, or the complete absence of any evidence explaining how a solo hiker became so disoriented that he fell into a ravine and then, in a moment of extraordinary and unlikely coordination, ended up at the bottom of a location he could not have reached. But I remember Michael Williams pulling me aside at the ranger station. He said, "That was not a hiking accident." I said, "No, it was not." He looked at me directly. His weathered face was very still. He said, "Did you read the Mitchell report from earlier this month?" I had. I told him I had. He said, "The timelines line up with the areas where Pierce was hiking. The bipedal sighting was north of his route. The campsite was north and west of the sighting. If I am reading the map right, Pierce's route took him directly through the territory where she said she saw something." I had not made that connection. I sat at the table in the ranger station and looked at the maps again. Michael was correct. David Pierce's hiking loop took him through an area where someone else had reported a large bipedal creature 3 weeks prior. I said, "You are thinking it was a bear standing up." Michael said, "I am thinking that if this happens again, we need to look at it differently than the first time. That is all I am saying." It happened again 6 days later. A couple, both in their 60s, departed the Jacksana Lake trailhead early one morning. They did not have backpacking equipment. They were doing a day hike, a modest 4-mile loop that was specifically marketed to visitors of intermediate ability who wanted to see the lake and return to their vehicle by evening. They never returned. Their car sat in the trailhead parking lot, unoccupied. As evening turned to night, turned to the next morning. We found their bodies within 18 hours. They were off-trail, nearly 4 kilometers from the hiking loop, in a location that would have required deliberate navigation to reach. They were not injured. They had simply ceased living. The preliminary examination suggested that they had been alive for most of the night. They were found lying next to each other, their bodies positioned as if they had lain down together and simply stopped breathing. There was an odor at the scene. It was not decomposition, because they had not been dead long enough for that. It was something else. It was organic and musky and intensely foreign. It clung to the bodies. It saturated the ground around them. Emily brought in outside consultants. A veterinary pathologist suggested an encounter with a predator, followed by fatal injuries that had failed to develop immediately visible trauma. He proposed a large bear, a mountain lion, a predator large enough to immobilize human prey and leave them without immediately obvious wounds. But the bodies had been arranged. They were positioned carefully, almost gently, next to each other. No predator arranges its kill. I was 34 years old, and I was beginning to understand that something was changing in the park I had sworn to protect. Something was shifting in the calculation that governed the distance between humans and the wild things that inhabited these mountains. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that precedes a storm. By the 1st of July, we had 3 confirmed deaths in 6 weeks. The official reports described them in isolation: a hiking accident, a tragedy involving lost hikers, an encounter with wildlife gone wrong. Nobody connected them externally. News coverage was minimal. The Park Service pushed a narrative of visitor education and reasonable wilderness precautions, but internally we were looking at patterns. Michael Williams created a map. He plotted the locations of each incident. He added in the Mitchell report. He began tracking all wildlife complaints that had been filed in the previous year. What emerged was not random. There was a geographic corridor. There was a progression. The incidents were moving. In June, the Mitchell sighting had been south and west. The Pierce body had been found northwest, closer to the glaciated regions. The couple had been discovered even further north, in an area of the park that saw very few visitors. Jessica Garcia voiced what we were all thinking. She asked, "Is something chasing the hikers north?" Michael said, "I think something is directing them north." Emily did not approve of this kind of speculation. She called us together in her office, closed the door, and told us explicitly that any further discussion of predatory behavior had to remain within the ranger station. She was concerned about panic. She was concerned about the Park Service shutting down sections of Wrangell St. Elias for investigation, which would impact the economy of local communities and reduce the park's tourism revenue. She was concerned about liability. What she did not say, but what everyone understood, was that she was concerned about her position. A park superintendent whose territory was being systematically decimated by something authorities could not identify and could not control was a liability that the National Park Service would solve by reassignment. So we said nothing. But we also began changing our protocols. Robert Wilson started conducting dawn patrols in the northern sections. Michael Williams began checking in with backcountry hikers with more frequency, confirming their locations and their condition. I spent more time in the field, noting animal activity, tracking patterns in the wilderness. It was during one of these patrols that I encountered the physical evidence that changed everything. I was hiking in the Nabesna Valley, about 8 kilometers from the nearest trail. I was investigating reports of a large presence in the area. Park visitors had described seeing something massive moving through the high meadows. I did not expect to find anything. Physical evidence of large animals in wilderness areas is typically limited to scat, tracks, or territorial markings. What I found was a structure. It was located in a small clearing surrounded by stands of spruce and aspen. The structure was made entirely of branches and deadwood arranged in a pattern that was impossible to attribute to natural wind or weather. It formed something resembling a shelter or a nest. It was approximately 3 meters across and 2 meters high. Inside, the ground had been scraped clear and lined with dried grass and what appeared to be shed hair. The hair was remarkable. It was between 7 and 12 centimeters long, dark brown, coarse in texture. It was nothing I recognized from any animal I had cataloged in my years of park service. It was too thick and too long to be from a black bear. It was the wrong texture for a moose. It was not from any predator I could identify. I collected samples. I documented the structure with photographs. I recorded the GPS coordinates. I did not report it to Emily. Instead, I brought the samples to Michael Williams at his home in the evening, away from the ranger station and away from any official channels. He examined the hair under a magnifying glass. His expression did not change, but his hands were very still. He said, "This is not bear." I said, "No." He said, "This is not anything I have ever seen." I said, "I know." Michael was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My grandfather used to tell stories about creatures that moved through the high country. He called them the old people. He said they were not interested in people, not interested in hunting us, but they did not tolerate being observed. They did not tolerate being pursued. He said if you saw one, and if it knew you had seen it, you were in profound danger." I said, "Your grandfather was Tlingit." Michael said, "Yes, he was from the coastal regions, but the old stories traveled. The old stories described creatures that moved through all the wild places. He said they had a kind of intelligence that humans do not have the framework to understand." I did not believe in folklore. I believed in ecology, in behavior patterns, in the quantifiable data that biology and wilderness management were built upon. But I was holding a strand of hair that could not be identified by any of my training, and I was looking at a structure that required tools and planning to build. Michael said, "I think something is establishing territory in our park. I think it is establishing a perimeter. And I think the hikers that have disappeared or died were not random. I think they were encounters that occurred on the boundaries of that territory." I said, "Are you telling me that you think there is a Bigfoot in Wrangell St. Elias National Park?" Michael said, "I am telling you that I think there is something. What we call it is less important than understanding what it wants." The deaths accelerated. The second week of July brought 3 more victims. A family of 4 set out on a 3-day hiking excursion. Only one member of that family emerged from the wilderness. The survivor, a 13-year-old boy named Thomas, was incoherent and severely dehydrated. He could not explain what had happened to his parents or his younger sister. He could only repeat the same phrase over and over. He said, "It knew we were there. It knew the whole time." The Park Service finally closed the affected regions. Emily called an emergency meeting with the regional superintendent. I was not present, but I heard the details from Ashley Martinez, who monitored the radio communications. The superintendent was outraged. He demanded to know why the park had waited until 4 people had died before implementing any access restrictions. Emily defended herself by citing the lack of concrete evidence that any particular predator was responsible. She cited the typical hiking accident statistics. She cited the need to balance public access with risk management, but the numbers had become too large to explain away. By the end of the second week of July, we had recorded 9 deaths. 9 hikers had entered the wilderness in the northern and northwestern sections of Wrangell St. Elias and had not emerged. 4 bodies had been recovered. 5 individuals had simply disappeared. The regional superintendent closed the entire northern section of the park to all hiking, backcountry travel, and vehicle access. He initiated a wildlife survey to determine if any previously unidentified predator species had established territory in the park. He requested a team of biologists from the state university to investigate, and then he did something that proved to be fatally inadequate. He authorized a hunting expedition. The logic, as explained to us, was that if an unknown predator was responsible for the deaths, then the removal of that predator would solve the problem. A team of licensed hunters would be brought in. They would conduct a systematic survey of the closed areas. They would attempt to locate and eliminate any large predator responsible for the deaths. The operation would last 10 days, and it would involve a team of 8 individuals, including 2 state wildlife specialists, 4 licensed hunters, and 2 park rangers who would serve as guides. Michael Williams and I were selected to be the guides. We departed on July 23rd. The team assembled at the Nebezna District Ranger Station. The hunters were professional outdoorsmen. They were quiet and competent. They brought high-powered rifles and tracking equipment. They had a plan to grid search the area where I had found the structure, moving outward in expanding perimeters, looking for evidence of predatory behavior, unusual dens, fresh kills, or the creature itself. I had no hope that it would work. We moved into the wilderness on the first morning before dawn. We had 5 days allocated for the search. We carried supplies for that duration. We had radio communication with the ranger station. We had satellite phones as emergency backup. On the first day, we found nothing. On the second day, we discovered a clearing that had been freshly cleared by some large force. Trees had been pushed over. The ground had been excavated. There was evidence of something very large moving through the area. The specialists collected samples. They hypothesized a moose in rut, though the damage patterns seemed too intentional, too directed, for normal animal behavior. On the third day, we found the first sign that something was watching us. Robert Wilson noticed it first. He pointed to a ridge above our camp, maybe half a kilometer away. Something large was silhouetted against the sky. It stood on 2 legs. Its shape was humanoid but massive. It was there for perhaps 5 seconds, and then it was gone, moving into the tree cover with no sound that we could perceive. The hunters began moving toward the location immediately. I remember Michael grabbing my arm and saying something I will never forget. He said, "James, do not pursue it. Do not follow the thing into the trees." I said, "Why not?" "That is what we came to do." He said, "Because it is not moving away. It is moving toward the forest, yes, but not to escape. It is moving to a place of its choosing. It is controlling the chase, not fleeing from it. If we follow it into the trees, we are walking into a place where it has advantage." But we were following orders. The hunters were moving forward. We had to follow. The pursuit took us into a region of dense forest, steep terrain, and a network of ravines that made navigation extraordinarily difficult. The creature would appear, then vanish. We would find tracks, then lose them on rocky ground. The pursuit lasted for 6 hours. At the end of those 6 hours, we had covered nearly 8 kilometers and had lost radio contact with the ranger station. Ashley Martinez was frantic when we finally regained signal. She was requesting our positions, our status, our intentions. The specialists assured her that we had located evidence of the creature and were maintaining pursuit. That night, we camped in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. The hunters set up a perimeter watch. I remember standing guard with Michael in the early morning hours, around 3 o'clock in the morning, when the temperature drops and the human mind begins to fray at the edges. Michael said, "Do you hear that?" I did not hear anything for a moment. Then I did. It was a sound like wind moving through a canyon, except there was no wind. It came from the darkness around us. It seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. Michael said, "That is territorial. That is a declaration of something claiming this space." The sound continued for nearly an hour. The hunters were awake. They had weapons ready, but nobody fired because there was nothing to shoot at. The sound surrounded us, an acoustic presence that communicated intent and claiming, and a kind of ancient authority that made my hands shake. By dawn, we had made the decision to withdraw. The specialists were resistant. They wanted to continue the pursuit. They wanted to set up ambush positions. They wanted to bring more resources and continue the hunt. Michael convinced them otherwise. He explained that we were operating in territory where we had no advantage. He explained that the creature was demonstrating intelligence and coordination that indicated a level of consciousness that made a traditional hunting operation ineffective. He was polite and professional, but his message was clear. They were not going to kill this thing. They were going to die if they continued to pursue it. The hunters, to their credit, listened. We began the withdrawal from the forest on the morning of July 26th, but the creature did not allow an easy exit. We were descending a hillside, moving in a line through thick brush, when Michael, who was hiking in front of me, simply stopped. I collided with him and he turned to me with an expression I had never seen before. He whispered, "Walk backward. Walk backward slowly and quietly. Do not run. Do not turn around." I did what he said. I walked backward, my eyes on his, understanding that something was behind me. One of the hunters broke protocol and turned around to look. He screamed. He raised his rifle. He fired 4 times, rapid shots that echoed through the forest. I turned around. For perhaps 2 seconds I saw it. It was approximately 2.5 meters tall, massively built, with an upper body that resembled a primate and a face that was almost human but not quite. It was covered entirely in dark hair. Its eyes were fixed on our group with an expression of extraordinary intelligence. It was not attacking. It was simply observing, the way you might observe something you found interesting. Then it was gone, moving into the forest with a speed that was impossible for anything so large. The hunter who had fired was gasping for breath. He said, "That was not a bear. That was not anything that should exist." We evacuated the mountains that day. We moved at a pace that bordered on reckless, accepting injuries and exhaustion as preferable to remaining in that territory. We reached the ranger station at evening on July 26th. The team of hunters departed the following morning. The report they submitted was official and measured. They confirmed the presence of an unidentified large predator. They recommended the continuation of the area closure. They made no mention of what they had actually seen. The park remained closed through the end of July and into August. The state university sent biologists who conducted surveys of the closed region. They found hair samples consistent with the samples I had collected. They found enormous tracks pressed into soft ground. They collected scat samples that did not match any animal in their database. Their official conclusion was that an unidentified species of large primate or primate-adjacent creature had established territory in the northern regions of Wrangell St. Elias. They could not explain how such a creature had gone unidentified by science. They could not explain how it had established a viable breeding population without any previous documentation. They recommended continued monitoring and the maintenance of the park closure. But the state wildlife agency was pressing for a different course of action. They wanted to capture the creature alive. They assembled a team. They brought tranquilizer guns and containment equipment. They began preparations to enter the wilderness on August 8th with the intention of sedating and capturing the unknown creature. Emily was required to provide ranger support. Michael and I were not selected this time. Instead, Jessica Garcia and Robert Wilson were assigned to the capture expedition. I watched them prepare with a feeling of profound dread. I remember speaking with Jessica the evening before she was scheduled to depart. She was nervous but enthusiastic. She said, "If we can capture this thing alive, we can study it, we can understand what it is, we can understand why it is here and whether it poses a genuine threat to human visitors." I said, "Jessica, that creature is not going to let itself be captured." She said, "How do you know that? Maybe it is not hostile toward humans. Maybe it is just defending territory." I said, "The hikers that have died were in its territory. It killed them. That suggests that it sees us as an intrusion that warrants termination." Jessica said, "That is one interpretation. Or it is possible that they were killed in self-defense, that they were hiking in an area that the creature considered essential territory, that it was protecting its space the way any animal would protect its space. If we approach with tranquilizer equipment and minimal threat presentation, perhaps it will not feel the need to attack." I could not argue with her logic. I could only explain what I felt, which was that we were underestimating the intelligence and the intentionality of what we were dealing with. I could not articulate it in a way that she would accept. The capture expedition departed on the morning of August 8th. The team consisted of 6 wildlife specialists and 2 rangers. They were equipped with high-powered tranquilizer guns and equipped to conduct monitoring and tracking. They had a satellite communication system and a predetermined route that would take them through the area where the majority of evidence had been collected. The expedition was scheduled to last 8 days. On the 4th day, Robert Wilson's satellite phone transmitted a single message to the ranger station. Ashley Martinez received it around 2 in the afternoon. The message consisted of 3 words: "Get more help." No status report. No specific information about threat. No location details. Just 3 words that conveyed the scale of a situation that the expedition was no longer equipped to handle. Emily immediately made calls to the State Wildlife Agency, the Regional Park Service headquarters, and the state police. She requested emergency response and helicopter support. She initiated the protocol for missing persons in the wilderness. That evening, we received a second transmission from Robert. 2 missing. 1 confirmed injured. Do not send in ground teams. Aerial support only. The implication was devastating. The expedition had been engaged. Members were down. The territory itself was too dangerous for standard rescue procedures. A helicopter was deployed at dawn on August 13th. It conducted an aerial survey of the region where the expedition had last transmitted their location. They located the camp in a small valley, but it had been destroyed. Equipment was scattered across a 200-meter area. There were no bodies. There was no sign of the expedition members. A second helicopter, this one equipped with infrared scanning and spotting capability, spent the next 6 hours surveying the surrounding territory. At approximately 1 in the afternoon, they located movement in a dense forest valley several kilometers from the destroyed camp. They reported seeing a large bipedal shape moving through the tree cover. It appeared to be accompanied by smaller shapes, though the dense canopy made detailed observation impossible. The state police coordinated a ground team that included myself, Michael Williams, and 6 trained law enforcement officers. We were inserted via helicopter at the edge of the forest valley. We were instructed to attempt to locate and recover any expedition members, prioritize the safety of existing park staff, and avoid direct engagement with the creature. The instructions were simultaneously clear and impossible. We moved into the forest at around 2 in the afternoon. The terrain was steep and heavily vegetated. The forest floor was covered in moss and decomposing wood that made navigation slow and unpredictable. We were hiking nearly blind, following the rough coordinates where the helicopter had spotted movement. We found Jessica Garcia approximately 3 kilometers from the insertion point. She was alive, but barely. She was suffering from severe dehydration and what appeared to be a concussion. She had no memory of the previous 4 days. She did not remember the expedition encountering the creature. She did not remember the camp being attacked. She had regained consciousness in a cave, alone, with no equipment and no idea how she had arrived at that location. We extracted her immediately by helicopter. She was taken to a hospital in Anchorage for evaluation. The doctors would later confirm that she had suffered trauma consistent with a severe impact and significant blood loss that should have been fatal. But they could not explain why she was alive. The ground team continued the search for the remaining expedition members. We found Robert Wilson approximately 5 kilometers deeper into the forest, moving slowly through the dense vegetation. He was conscious. He was ambulatory. But he was in a state of profound psychological shock. When we reached him, he looked at us with an expression of absolute terror. He was trying to communicate something, but the words were incoherent. He kept repeating the same phrase over and over. It has them. It kept them. It wanted to keep them. We evacuated Robert immediately. We spent another 6 hours searching for the remaining 4 expedition members. We found nothing. No bodies. No blood evidence. No equipment. Nothing to explain what had happened to them. By evening, the search was called off. The ground team was extracted. The Park Service had lost 4 members of a capture expedition to an entity they could not identify and could not predict. What happened next happened quickly, with a precision that suggested planning beyond what I thought the creature was capable of. On August 19th, the State Wildlife Agency received a report from a hiking group that had entered the park through an access point to the east, in an area that had technically remained open to the public. The hikers reported seeing 5 individuals moving through the high meadows in the direction of the park interior. The individuals, according to the report, appeared to be in good health and were traveling with deliberate coordination toward the mountain wilderness. The 5 individuals matched the descriptions of the 4 missing expedition members plus Jessica Garcia, who had been hospitalized in Anchorage. But Jessica was hospitalized. She had not been discharged. She was under observation in the intensive care unit. Yet someone who matched her description was hiking into the wilderness. Emily contacted the hospital immediately. Jessica was still there. The hospital confirmed that she had been monitored continuously. She had not left her bed. She had not been discharged. Someone else, or something else, was wearing her appearance. Michael said. When I told him, that is not possible, I said. The hikers described 5 people moving toward the mountains. 4 of them are the missing expedition members. The 5th is Jessica, Michael said. But Jessica is in the hospital. I said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, James, I think we need to talk about what this creature actually is. We sat in his home, away from the ranger station, away from anyone who could overhear. Michael said, my grandfather told stories about territorial creatures, but he told other stories too. He told stories about creatures that could mimic human form. He said they could not do it perfectly. He said that if you looked closely, you would see something wrong with the mimicry. But he said they could do it well enough to fool most people at a distance. He said that they did this to steal people, to draw people deeper into the wilderness. I said, that is folklore. That is mythology. Michael said, yes, it is. It is also what we are observing. I said, what would be the purpose? What would it gain by drawing hikers into the wilderness? Michael said, territory, resources, the way humans expand territory by attracting other humans to settle new areas, the way humans establish populations by drawing people to new frontiers. I think this creature or these creatures are doing the same thing. I think they are bringing people deeper into the mountains. I think they are establishing a presence by accumulating human numbers into their territory. I said, that is mass abduction. That is kidnapping. Michael said, yes, I think it is. I wanted to dismiss what he was saying. I wanted it to be impossible. But I had seen something in the forest that did not fit any classification system I understood. I had experienced patterns that suggested intention and planning. I had observed a level of intelligence in the creature that was not consistent with normal animal behavior. We reported the sighting of the 5 individuals to Emily and the regional authorities. We initiated another search. This time, we brought a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging. We flew over the northern regions of the park, looking for large gatherings of human bodies. What we found was extraordinary. In a series of high mountain valleys, in areas that were difficult to access even for experienced mountaineers, we detected thermal signatures that suggested the presence of dozens of human beings. The concentrations were scattered across multiple valley systems, but they were clearly organized and clearly coordinated. The Park Service immediately initiated an emergency response. Helicopters were deployed. Ground teams were coordinated with state police. Multiple agencies converged on the park to initiate a mass rescue and recovery operation. I was assigned to lead a team into one of the valleys where thermal signatures had been detected. We were inserted by helicopter at dawn on August 21st. We moved through steep terrain and dense forest toward the coordinates where the thermal imaging had detected a concentration of approximately 30 human bodies. What we discovered was not a rescue situation. The individuals we found were alive. They were conscious. They were situated in a large clearing in the valley. They were sitting in organized rows, facing toward the highest peaks of the mountain range. They were completely silent. When we approached them, they did not respond to verbal communication. They did not acknowledge our presence. They did not indicate any awareness that rescue was occurring. One of the police officers attempted to physically guide one of the individuals toward the helicopter. The person resisted with surprising strength. When the officer persisted, the person's face began to change. The features distorted. The skin texture altered. The human quality of the appearance became corrupted and unstable. We evacuated immediately. The official report that went to the regional authorities was that the individuals we encountered appeared to be suffering from mass psychogenic illness, a state of psychological disruption that had synchronized across multiple individuals. The recommendation was to evacuate them to medical facilities for psychological evaluation and treatment. Over the next 5 days, helicopters extracted approximately 143 individuals from the mountain valleys. They were transported to medical facilities throughout Alaska. They were subjected to extensive psychological and neurological evaluation. The findings were disturbing. Most of the individuals had no memory of how they had arrived in the mountains. Most reported losing time, losing continuity, losing the ability to distinguish between their own thoughts and thoughts that seemed to come from outside themselves. Most exhibited symptoms of severe psychological trauma, dissociation, and what the evaluating specialists described as a kind of deep spiritual disruption that did not respond to conventional psychiatric treatment. But they were alive, and they were human. The incident became international news. The Park Service conducted press conferences attempting to explain what had occurred. They described a mass abduction by an unidentified entity. They announced the closure of Wrangell St. Elias National Park for an indefinite period pending investigation. And then, after weeks of silence, after the news cycle had moved on to other stories, after the focus of the media had shifted to other disasters and other horrors, something else emerged from the investigation. One of the retrieved individuals provided a clear memory of what had occurred in the mountains. She described being taken by something that appeared humanoid but was not human. She described being brought to a location in the high mountains where other humans were being gathered. She described being placed among them in organized formations. She described a sensation of her individual consciousness being pulled outward, as if her sense of self was dissolving into something larger and more complex. And then she described something that changed everything. She said that the creature had told her, or had communicated to her in a way that bypassed language, that it was creating a settlement, that it was building a population, that the humans that had been gathered were being prepared for something, transformed into something, incorporated into something. She said that the creature, or creatures, because she was certain there were multiple entities involved, were not interested in hunting humans or harming humans. They were interested in incorporating humans into their own structure. They were interested in creating a hybrid population that was part human and part something else, and she said that they were going to succeed. 3 months have passed since the evacuation of Wrangell St. Elias National Park. The park remains officially closed. No visitors are permitted. No research teams are authorized. The grounds belong entirely to the creatures that inhabit them. I was interviewed by federal agents. I was interviewed by Park Service investigators. I was interviewed by specialists from agencies I did not know existed. Every conversation followed the same pattern. I was asked to recount events. I was asked to explain details. I was asked whether I believed the theories being circulated about what was actually happening in the wilderness. I told them the truth, or as much of it as I was able to articulate. I told them that I had encountered something in the mountains that was intelligent, that it was large, that it was capable of planning and coordination, that it appeared to have an understanding of human behavior and human psychology that was sophisticated enough to manipulate it. I told them that I believed the individuals who had been retrieved from the mountain valleys had experienced something that was beyond the framework of my understanding, that they had been exposed to a kind of consciousness or intelligence that operated through different mechanisms than human intelligence. I told them that I did not believe the situation was over. I told them that I believed the entity or entities in the park had not finished whatever process they had initiated, and I told them that I believed they would come again. After the interviews, I was assigned to a different park. I left Wrangell St. Elias, though not without profound reluctance. I left knowing that something had changed in that territory. I left knowing that the normal calculations of wilderness management and predator behavior had been rendered obsolete by the presence of something that operated according to rules I did not understand. Michael Williams submitted a resignation letter and left the Park Service entirely. I ran into him once, 3 months after the evacuation, and he told me that he was returning to his family's traditional lands on the coast. He said he needed to be in places where the boundaries between human and wild were still clearly defined. He said he needed to be in places where the old knowledge still held power. Jessica Garcia recovered physically from her time in the mountains, but the psychological effects persisted. She was granted a leave of absence from the Park Service. I heard that she was undergoing intensive therapy and that she had moved to live with family in Southern California, as far from wilderness areas as she could manage. Robert Wilson was less fortunate. He was discharged from the hospital after 2 weeks, declared fit for duty, and reassigned to a park in the lower 48. But he was not well. He had recurring nightmares. He had panic episodes. He had episodes where he could not distinguish between the present moment and moments from his time in the mountains. He committed suicide 8 months after the evacuation. The 4 expedition members who were recovered from the mountains never fully recovered their sense of individual selfhood. They lived, but they existed in a state of psychological displacement, as if a part of themselves had been left behind in the mountains and they were existing in the world as partially present versions of who they had been before. The death toll from the summer of 2018 was ultimately registered as follows: 15 individuals confirmed dead, 9 individuals exhibiting severe and persistent psychological disruption consistent with trauma, 1 individual deceased by suicide, 1 park permanently closed, 1 profession forever changed. I still work for the Park Service. I am assigned to a park in the lower 48, a place of moderate elevations and clear boundaries between human areas and wilderness areas. I teach ranger training courses about wilderness safety and predator behavior. I tell the official stories about what happened in Wrangell St. Elias, but I know the truth. I know that in the high mountains of that park, something is still present. Something is still planning. Something is still building whatever structure it was constructing with the humans that were gathered in those valleys. I know because the dreams have not stopped. I dream of those high meadows. I dream of the valleys where the 143 individuals were found, sitting in organized rows, their consciousness being rewoven into something larger and more complex. And sometimes, in those dreams, I feel the pull myself. I feel the sensation of something reaching toward my consciousness, attempting to extend itself through the barriers of individual awareness. I have not returned to Wrangell St. Elias since I was transferred. I have not allowed myself to return because I fear what would happen if I did. I fear that the pull I felt in those dreams would become more than a dream. I fear that the entity has not forgotten me. I fear that what was begun in the mountains in the summer of 2018 is still ongoing, and that eventually, inevitably, it will expand beyond the boundaries of that protected wilderness. It will expand into our world. The park remains closed. No official timeline has been established for reopening. No one is asking the hard questions about what it would mean if that park and the territory it contains could never be returned to human use. But everyone knows, everyone understands that we lost something in Wrangell St. Elias beyond the lives that were taken. We lost the illusion that the wild places of America are fundamentally separate from the human world. We lost the comfortable distance between civilization and the creatures that exist beyond the boundaries of our protection. We learned that that distance is not measured in kilometers or tree lines or designated wilderness boundaries. It is measured in attention. And we, in our carelessness, in our willingness to push further and deeper into places we do not understand, have proven that we are not very good at paying attention. That is the account of James Smith, the ranger who survived Wrangell St. Elias. Whether you believe it, whether you accept the events as he reported them, is your choice. What cannot be disputed is that something occurred in that park in the summer of 2018 that the Park Service has never fully explained. Wrangell St. Elias remains closed to this day. Thank you for listening to this episode. Please subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you do not miss our deepest dives into American folklore and wilderness horror. Leave a like on this video, and please leave a comment below with your city and your local time. We read every single comment. What do you think happened in those mountains? Do you believe the official narrative? Do you think something is still happening in the closed territories of Alaska? Tell us your theory. Until next time, stay safe in the places you explore. We will see you in the next episode. I was not supposed to come back to Inside Passage. That was the agreement I made with myself 17 years ago when I left my position as a ranger and swore I would never return to those waters, those forests, those places where the coastline seemed less like geography and more like a mouth that had already decided to swallow you. But grief has a way of breaking every promise you make to yourself, and here I was on the ferry heading back to the ranger station where I had worked half my life. Because Ronald Green called me and said we had a missing persons situation that required someone who knew the old trails. I had learned to live a different life in the South. I worked administrative positions. I lived in apartments where the walls were close and comforting. I did not think about the way the fog in Inside Passage moved like something with intention. I did not think about Amy Baker, but Ronald's voice on the phone had carried a weight I recognized. He said Amy had gone missing on the Hanging Valley Trail. She was 51 years old, cautious, and had been hiking with a group. The group was Jason Adams, Julie Nelson, and two newer rangers, Ryan Carter and Sharon Mitchell. They had gone up the trail at dawn. By noon, Amy had wandered away from the main group to photograph wildflowers near the tree line. When they turned to follow her, she was gone. There was no sign of struggle. There was no sign of anything except the trail itself. Still rising into the mist, still patient. I arrived at the ranger station on a Thursday afternoon in late June when the light lingered in the sky until nearly midnight. The station had not changed much in nearly 2 decades. The same cedar siding, the same large windows facing the water, the same smell of coffee and old maps and something underneath those scents that I had never been able to name. Ronald was waiting for me in the main office. He had aged significantly. His hair was white now, truly white. Not the gray I remembered, and his face carried the particular exhaustion of a man who had stopped sleeping through the night. He told me everything as we drove toward the trailhead. The search had been ongoing for 4 days. Helicopters had come and gone. They had found her boot near the creek that ran parallel to the Hanging Valley Trail, but nothing else. No body, no clothing, no indication of direction or intention. He said the thing that bothered him most was that the boot was positioned too carefully. It was not where someone would lose it while struggling or falling. It was placed. He said he knew I would understand what he meant. I understood. We arrived at the trailhead where Gary Perez, one of the senior rangers, was organizing the grid search from a field station. Laura Roberts was with him, coordinating supplies. They both gave me the kind of nods that people give to others who share a particular and unbearable knowledge. Gary had been a ranger in those days. He had been part of the team that had searched for Sarah Chen in 1998. We did not speak about that. There was nothing useful to say. The search area was 3 square miles of forest that looked like it had not been disturbed since the Ice Age. The trees grew so densely that even in June, even with the daylight lasting until near midnight, there were places where the permanent shadows seemed to suggest a different time of day. The creek that ran through the valley was fast and cold and made a sound like something trying to communicate urgently across a great distance. I had hoped that returning would feel strange, that the place would be unfamiliar enough that I could maintain some distance from it. Instead, it felt like returning to a conversation I had walked away from mid-sentence. The forest seemed to pick up exactly where we had left off. On the first day, I led the teams into the upper reaches of the valley where few people ventured. Gary Perez asked why we were searching that high, and I told him it was procedure. I was lying. Procedure would have meant staying in the grid pattern, methodical and safe. But I knew something about Amy Baker that Ronald had not told me over the phone, something that had not been included in any official report. I knew that in 1998, Amy Baker had been hiking with Sarah Chen when Sarah disappeared, and I knew that Amy had been searching for something ever since that day. Searching and returning and searching again, like someone who had lost not a person but an answer to a question she did not know how to ask. I found the first sign near the twisted pine tree that grew horizontal to the ground, roots exposed like something trying to escape. It was a blue scarf, just fabric caught on a branch. But it smelled like Amy. It smelled like the specific intersection of her perfume and her fear and the water from the creek below. Behind me, I could hear the other search team members moving through the forest with the sound of humans trying to be quiet, which is to say with the sound of humans announcing themselves to everything that was listening. I tucked the scarf into my jacket and continued deeper into the valley. By sunset, I found her glasses near the edge of the tree line where the forest opens into what the old maps called the Hanging Meadow. They were broken. One lens was shattered in a pattern that looked almost like a map, with thin fracture lines radiating outward like roads leading nowhere. Below the meadow, the creek roared louder than it had anywhere else, having picked up speed from a series of drops in the terrain. I was standing there, holding those glasses, when I realized that no one else was behind me anymore. I had walked so far ahead that the sound of the other searchers had faded completely. The light was starting to change toward what Inside Passage called evening. A slow dimming that did not feel like the arrival of darkness but more like the world settling into its true state after pretending to be bright all day. That was when I heard the sound. It came from above, from the direction of the ridgeline, but it was not a sound that any animal I knew how to identify would make. It was low and resonant, a sound like someone calling a name underwater, or like wind moving through a space that was too large to fully comprehend. It lasted for perhaps 5 seconds, then it stopped, and in the stopping, the forest seemed to lean in closer. I have spent 17 years trying to convince myself that I had misidentified a wildlife sound, that it was a bear or a large cat or some other explicable thing with a name and taxonomy and a place in the natural world. But I know what I heard. I have known since I heard it. I turned and walked back toward the other searchers. I did not run. Running was how people died in Inside Passage, but I walked with purpose, following my own footprints backward through the undergrowth, keeping my eyes on the ground, and trying not to think about what had made that sound or whether it had stopped calling because it had found what it was looking for. When I returned to the search team, Gary asked where I had gone. I told him that I had lost the trail markers. He did not believe me. After 17 years away, my face still carried the look of someone who had seen something behind the world that most people never had to acknowledge. We searched until nearly midnight, and then we returned to the ranger station as the light finally failed completely and the stars emerged like small holes punched in something. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in the office at the ranger station with the windows open to the sound of the water, and I read through the missing persons reports from 1998. Sarah Chen disappeared from Hanging Valley Trail on June 22nd. Sarah Chen, aged 46, experienced hiker, hiking with one companion, Amy Baker. Amy had been the sole witness to Sarah's disappearance. She had told investigators that Sarah had stepped behind a tree to adjust her boot. When Amy looked back, she was gone. No sign of struggle, no direction of travel. no footprints leading anywhere. The report concluded that Sarah Chen had likely fallen into the creek and was swept downstream. Her body had never been recovered. Probable death by misadventure. Case closed. I had not believed it in 1998. I did not believe it now. At dawn on the second day, we found Amy Baker's body near the exit of a narrow ravine that opened downslope from the hanging meadow. She was lying in a position that suggested she had fallen, and she had been in the forest long enough that early decomposition was evident. But her eyes were still open, and they were looking at something that was not in the ravine. They were looking upslope, toward the ridgeline, toward the highest places. There was also something else, which I reported to Ronald, and which he reported to the authorities, and which appeared in the official investigation report, but which no one really knew how to categorize. Amy's fingernails were packed with soil that appeared to have come from the highest reaches of the hanging valley, above the tree line, in places that would have required climbing and scrambling and intent. But her body was found below that area, in a ravine where she could not possibly have gone voluntarily and survived. The authorities concluded that perhaps she had been hiking in those higher elevations and had fallen, and the body had moved downslope after death due to natural processes of settling and environmental action. This explanation bothered me the way incorrect names bother people who know the correct ones. It was in the right family of explanations, but it was not right. That evening, after the body had been recovered and the news had been delivered to Amy's family and the official search had been called off, I was packing my belongings to leave Inside Passage again. I had fulfilled my obligation. Ronald did not ask me to stay. He knew better. But Gary Perez stopped me as I was loading my truck. He asked if I would come back inside the station for a moment. I followed him to the archives room, where the old files were kept. Reports from decades of ranger work in Inside Passage. He handed me a folder. Inside were photographs and notes and a map marked with dates and locations. The folder was labeled with a single name and a year: Patterson, Douglas, 1984. Gary said that he knew Amy had been searching for something. He said that Amy was not the first person to disappear from Hanging Valley Trail after 25 years. And he said that if I wanted to understand what had happened to her, I should read the Douglas Patterson file. I took the folder. I drove through the night. I did not open it until I reached the highway, when I pulled into a rest area 100 miles south of Inside Passage and began to read the story of a ranger who had gone missing in 1984 while searching for evidence of a large bipedal creature in the high valleys above the tree line. Douglas Patterson had been a ranger in Inside Passage for 11 years when he went missing. The files described him as methodical, careful, and somewhat obsessive about the wild areas that few people knew how to navigate. In 1982, he began to document unusual evidence in the high valleys: large footprints, hair samples that did not match any identified species, calls that seemed too intelligent to come from any known animal. He filed reports. He submitted findings. He was told that he was experiencing the kind of pattern recognition that humans do naturally, finding shapes in randomness, seeing intention in coincidence. But Douglas Patterson did not stop looking. According to his personal journal entries, which had been preserved in the file, he became convinced that something very large was living in the areas above the tree line, in the places where the maps showed nothing but elevation and stone. He believed that it rarely came down to the lower elevations where most hikers and rangers traveled. But he believed that under certain circumstances it came down. And when it did, people disappeared. The journal entries became increasingly detailed. Patterson had started mapping locations where unusual incidents had occurred over the previous 10 years. Not just disappearances, but falls, injuries, times when people had become confused about direction, times when experienced hikers had reported feeling watched. He had drawn connecting lines between these points. He had written notes about seasonal variations and weather patterns and migration routes. On June 24, 1984, Douglas Patterson set out on the Hanging Valley Trail to photograph and document what he believed was evidence of activity in the upper elevations. He left a detailed note describing his route and his expected return time. He expected to return by 6 in the evening. He did not return. The search for Douglas Patterson lasted 2 weeks. It covered an area of nearly 10 square miles. It found nothing: no body, no equipment, no clothing, no sign that Douglas Patterson had ever existed beyond that point on the trail where he had begun his final hike. The official report concluded that he had likely suffered an accident in the high terrain and that his body had come to rest in a location where weather and wildlife had prevented recovery. But there were notes in the file from rangers who had worked the search. Gary Perez had been a younger man then, just starting his career. His notes were brief and professional. but they carried a subtext that was difficult to ignore. One entry read, "The tracks above tree line did not look like anything I can identify. Patterson found something. Patterson found it because he was looking for it. That made him different. That made him the wrong thing to find." Below that, someone else had written, "Douglas would have known that. He knew what he was looking for. He knew what it meant to find it. Maybe he wanted to be found." I closed the file and sat in the darkness of the rest area parking lot and tried to understand what Gary Perez had been telling me by giving me this history. And I understood that Amy Baker had been searching for Douglas Patterson as much as she had been searching for Sarah Chen. That she had been returning to Inside Passage year after year, hiking the trails, looking for evidence of something that the official world had decided did not exist. I called Ronald Green from the rest area phone. It was 3 in the morning. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had not been sleeping either. I asked him if Amy Baker had taken any leave time in recent years. I asked him if Amy had been hiking the trails during her time off. There was a long pause, and then Ronald admitted that yes, Amy had requested frequent days off. And yes, some of those days had coincided with the times when she was hiking. He said that he had assumed she was just trying to stay healthy, to maintain her fitness. I told him that was not why she was hiking. I told him that Amy was following a map that no one had given her permission to use. A map that had been drawn in 1984 by a man who had understood something about Inside Passage that made him willing to sacrifice his safety to learn more about it. Ronald asked me if I was saying that Amy had gone to the high valleys deliberately. He asked me if I was saying that Amy had wanted to disappear. I told him that I was saying that Amy had understood that the high valleys had been calling to people for a long time, that there had been a pattern long before Douglas Patterson, and there continued to be a pattern after him, and that Amy had decided that if there was a pattern there must be an answer, and if there was an answer it had to be found. The next morning, I made a decision that I knew was probably wrong. I called Ronald and told him that I was returning to Inside Passage, that I needed to see the place where Amy's body had been found, that I needed to understand the direction of the recovery, the specific location where she was positioned, the angle of her body relative to the terrain. When I arrived at the ranger station, Ronald took me to the location in person. It was a ravine that dropped approximately 40 feet before opening into a wider stream bed. The walls were steep and rocky and slick with spray from the water. The body had been found near the base of the ravine, partially submerged in the stream. Based on the recovery, it appeared that Amy had fallen from the top of the ravine and had sustained injuries consistent with that fall. But as I stood there, I realized something that the official investigation had not acknowledged. From the top of the ravine, you would have to deliberately step backward to fall. The ravine did not open up as a surprise. It announced itself. The ground fell away gradually. You would have to be looking the other way. You would have to be looking upslope. I climbed to the top of the ravine, following the direction where the body would have begun if it had fallen from above. And there, worn into the earth, were a series of prints. Not footprints, but larger marks, as if something had pressed its weight into the ground with significant force. And leading from those marks, pressed deep into the moss and vegetation, were what appeared to be drag marks. Not deep enough to suggest violence, deep enough to suggest purpose. I followed those marks for approximately 50 yards, upslope and away from the ravine. The marks increased in depth and clarity as I moved forward, suggesting that they had been made by something increasingly substantial. And then they simply ended. They did not fade out. They did not transition into any recognizable form of movement. They simply terminated at a flat area of stone where nothing would have left an impression. But the air at that point felt different. It felt colder, even though I was standing in direct sunlight. And there was a smell, not strong, but present. A smell like wet animal mixed with something earthier, something ancient. I stood there for a long time. I did not move. I did not try to follow any further. I understood that I had found the place where whatever had Amy had let her go. Or perhaps where Amy had chosen to come back. The distinction was not clear. When I returned to the ranger station, I told Ronald that we would not find Amy's killer, because nothing had killed Amy. She had chosen to go to the high places. She had chosen to climb toward the tree line and then beyond it, and she had chosen to look at something that no human was supposed to look at. And when she turned away, she had looked backward, still looking at it, and in that moment of not watching the ground, she had fallen. The thing in the high valleys had not pushed her. It had simply allowed her to look at it. That was enough. Ronald asked me if this was how I was planning to explain Amy Baker to her family. I told him no. I told him that I was going to file a report that she had been hiking alone and had suffered an accident. Her body had been recovered, the case would be closed, and no one would know that Amy had spent her last moments looking at something that connected her backward through time to Sarah Chen and forward to others who would come after her, drawn by the same questions and the same need to understand what lived in the high places. He asked me why I was protecting that thing. I told him that I was not protecting it. I was protecting us. Because if we acknowledged what Amy had found, if we admitted that there was something alive in the high valleys that was not in our taxonomy and not in our understanding, then we would have to change how we understood the wild places, and most people were not ready for that change. Most people needed the wild places to remain places of danger that they could understand and navigate and survive. They did not need the wild places to be places of contact, places where intelligence that was not human was watching and waiting and sometimes calling. I left Inside Passage for the second time with a promise to myself that I would never return. But I broke that promise because Gary Perez called me in the autumn and told me that Jason Adams was missing. Jason had been part of the search team that had looked for Amy. He was a senior ranger, experienced, careful, and he had gone missing on the Hanging Valley Trail in September, during a stretch of clear weather when conditions were ideal and when there was no reason for any accident to occur. I knew before I even arrived that I would find the same pattern. I knew that Jason had begun to search for the same answers that Amy had searched for, that he had read the files, that he had understood the pattern, and that he had gone looking for something that he believed he understood. When I arrived at the ranger station for the third time, Ronald was not there to greet me. Gary told me that Ronald had requested a medical leave, that he had admitted to his supervisor that he no longer believed the official explanations for the missing persons cases, that the stress of acknowledging the truth while reporting the lies had become unsustainable. I did not blame him. Cognitive dissonance was a kind of drowning, and he had been drowning for longer than I had. The search for Jason Adams followed the same trajectory as the search for Amy, the same frustration, the same absence of evidence in an area where evidence should have been found, the same final discovery of a body that raised more questions than it answered. Jason was found in a ravine 2 miles north of where Amy had been found. He was positioned on his back, his arms crossed over his chest, in a position that suggested he had been laid down carefully by something that understood human burial practices. His clothing was intact. His equipment was still on his back. His final photograph on his camera showed him standing at the edge of the tree line with the high valley beyond him, and he was smiling. In the last shot, something appeared at the edge of the frame, a dark shape that was too large to be human and too organized to be random shadow or reflection. I reported that the image was corrupted, that equipment malfunction in high altitude had damaged the photo file. It was a small lie in service of a larger protection, and I did not feel conflicted about it. What I felt was the growing certainty that the pattern was accelerating, that something was calling more loudly, that the thing in the high valleys was no longer waiting for people to find it. It was reaching down into the lower elevations. It was making itself known in ways that could not be denied by anyone paying attention. I asked Gary if anyone else had gone missing in Inside Passage in the recent past. He told me about Rachel Morrison, a ranger who had disappeared in 2002, about Thomas Wheeler who had been reported missing in 2008, about 4 hikers who had vanished in separate incidents between 2015 and 2017, all of them from the same trails. All of them from the same season, all of them from Inside Passage. I asked him why no one had connected these disappearances, why no one had seen the pattern. And Gary told me something that I have thought about every day since he said it. He told me that people do not see patterns in missing persons cases because missing persons cases make us uncomfortable. We explain them away as accidents or wildlife attacks or wandering dementia or hiking mistakes. We do anything except consider the possibility that there are places on Earth where human intelligence is not the dominant form, where human assumptions about safety do not apply, where we are visitors and we are being watched. The thing in Inside Passage had understood this for a very long time. It understood human denial. It understood human need for rational explanation. And it understood that the only people who would ever truly acknowledge its existence were the people who decided that they needed to find it, that they were willing to risk their lives to look at it, that they were ready to let it change what they believed about the world. Amy Baker had been ready. Jason Adams had been ready. Douglas Patterson had been ready. And Sarah Chen, whose body had never been recovered, whose disappearance had set all of this in motion, had been ready. I left Inside Passage for the third time with something different than resolve. I left with understanding. I understand now that the high valleys are not something separate from human civilization. They are not remote places that only affect remote people. They are part of the system, part of the ecosystem, part of the larger machinery of existence. And every time someone goes missing, every time something cannot be explained, every time we encounter a gap in our knowledge, we are being invited to acknowledge what lives in those gaps. I have not returned to Inside Passage since, but I have watched the news, and I have read the hiking incident reports, and I have paid attention to the patterns, and I can tell you with certainty that something is still calling from the high valleys. Something is still reaching down into the lower elevations where humans think they are safe. And something is still finding people who are ready to listen. Before you walk into the wild places, know that someone might be watching from beyond the tree line. Before you hike the trails that lead into remote country, understand that there are clearings and high valleys where the rules are different. And before you disappear, before you become one of the names on the missing persons list, ask yourself if you are ready for what you will find if you keep looking upward and calling into the dark. The pattern continues. The calling continues. An Inside Passage is still waiting for the next person who is ready to answer. I have been a park ranger for 23 years. In that time, I have watched the wilderness transform around me. I have seen ecosystems shift, animal populations move, and the seasons arrive with increasingly unpredictable timing. But I have never seen what I saw in Prince William Sound during the last autumn I will ever spend guarding these lands. This is the account of how something ancient and something wrong came to the surface of those waters, and how it changed everything I believed about the creatures I was hired to protect. My name is Anthony Lee. I am 57 years old now. I was 57 when it happened too, which seems important for some reason. When they ask me to recount those weeks, they always want me to start with the day I found the first carcass. But they are wrong. The story does not begin there. It begins the night before, when the landscape itself seemed to hold its breath. I was camped near Glacier Bay that October, about 8 kilometers from the main ranger station. The sound was unusually calm that year, unusually thin. I mean that in a metaphorical sense, though I suspect there was also something literal happening beneath the water that I did not yet understand. The usual autumn bustle of migratory birds had thinned considerably. The salmon runs had been light. Even the otters seemed subdued, staying closer to the rocky outcrops, as if nervous about venturing into open water. The temperature that night dropped to 31 degrees Fahrenheit. I remember checking my thermometer multiple times, confused by the unusual cold for that region and that season. I was warm enough in my tent, but something kept pulling me toward the flap, kept making me look out at the forest beyond the beach. There was no moon. The darkness was complete in a way that darkness rarely becomes. It was the kind of darkness that makes you question whether your eyes are actually open. Around 11 at night, I heard the first sound. I will not call it a howl because that word is too familiar, too rooted in things we understand. It was not a howl. It was a sound that began high and ended low, but not in any natural progression. It seemed to skip frequencies, to jump in ways that animal vocalizations should not jump. The hairs on my arms stood erect. I spent 3 seconds telling myself it was a whale. Then I opened the tent flap and listened again. The sound came again, and this time it seemed closer. And this time I heard something else layered beneath it. Breathing. Deliberate, measured breathing, but with a rhythm that was slightly wrong. Not quite even, not quite natural. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out into the darkness. The beam caught nothing but rocks and sparse vegetation. I waited there, light cutting into the black, for nearly 20 minutes. Then, very slowly, I pulled back inside and zipped the tent shut. That is not the kind of action a person takes because they are imagining things. I have learned to trust my instincts over the years. Those instincts kept me alive through several genuine wildlife encounters that could have gone badly. That night, those instincts told me to stay inside. That instincts told me that something large was moving through the darkness, and that whatever it was, it had noticed me. I did not sleep. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened. There were no more sounds. Occasionally I would hear the wind shift or a small animal move through the brush. But whatever had made that first sound seemed to have moved on, or decided to stop vocalizing. I spent the hours until dawn in a state of heightened awareness that was exhausting and useless in equal measure. When the sun finally began to emerge from behind the eastern peaks, I felt relief so profound that it bordered on euphoria. I also felt foolish. What had I actually heard? A wolf? There had been rumors of wolves in the region for years, though no confirmed sightings in decades. Some kind of large cat? That seemed unlikely, but no more unlikely than what my instincts were suggesting. I waited until full morning before leaving the tent. The beach was empty. The rocks were undisturbed. The only evidence that anything had happened at all was my own certainty that something had. I packed up camp slowly, deliberately. Every movement felt watched. Even after I had loaded everything into my ranger vehicle and was driving back toward the station, I felt the weight of observation. It would take me several days to understand that this feeling was not paranoia. It was instinct, and it was correct. The first carcass was a Sitka black-tailed deer. I found it the morning I returned to the station, caught on a snag about 200 meters from the main dock. The corpse had been in the water for at least 2 days, possibly longer. I could tell by the bloating, by the way the flesh had begun to separate in certain places, by the smell that rose from it as I pulled it up onto the rocks. I have handled dead animals before. Hunting accidents happen in these lands. Vehicle strikes occur. Natural causes claim wildlife regularly. I have never considered myself squeamish about death, but the state of this animal bothered me in ways that I struggled to articulate. The wound pattern was wrong. There was massive blunt force trauma across the entire left side of the creature's body. The ribs were shattered. The internal organs, or what remained of them, were pulverized. This was not a hunting death. This was not a natural predation. This was something done by something very large with incredible strength applied without any apparent technique or precision. I photographed the deer from multiple angles. I took samples. I made detailed notes. Then I contacted the regional office. A woman named Heather Perez, one of the regional supervisors, drove up from Anchorage that same afternoon. She was a methodical woman in her late 40s who had been with parks for over 20 years. She approached the carcass the way I had approached it, with careful observation and emotional distance. But I could see the moment her expression shifted. I could see the instant she realized that the wound pattern was unusual. We sat in the office afterward, drinking bad coffee that I had reheated too many times. Heather said, "What killed it?" I said, "I do not know." She said, "Bear." I said, "Bears kill efficiently." "This is not efficient." She said, "A bear in a bad mood. A bear defending territory. A bear that did not want to eat it, just needed to assert dominance." I did not argue with her, but I knew she was offering herself an explanation rather than examining the evidence. Bears are known factors. Bears are things we manage. Whatever had killed that deer did not fit into the management categories. But I kept that thought to myself. I was not interested in being marked as a ranger who saw mysteries in the natural world. I had worked too hard to maintain credibility. Over the next 6 days, we found 4 more animals. All of them bore similar wounds. A river otter, torn in half. A moose calf, nearly unidentifiable. 2 more deer. One of the deer still had its head attached, and I could see the terror in its remaining eye, even in death. The eye seemed to be looking at something just off to my left. I never could adjust to the angle properly to see what it might have been looking at. Mark Thompson, our primary wildlife management officer, was brought in on day 4. He was an older man, 65, with the kind of experience that comes from managing emergency situations across dozens of parks. He examined the carcasses with the systematic attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. He recorded measurements. He took tissue samples. He examined the distribution of wounds. On the second day of his investigation, he asked me to walk the perimeter with him. We covered 12 kilometers, looking for tracks, for scat, for any clear indication of what animal was responsible. We found nothing. There were no clear footprints. There were no droppings. There were no fur caught on branches. Whatever was killing the animals was leaving no trail. That was the moment I began to understand that we were not dealing with normal wildlife. Normal wildlife leaves evidence. Normal wildlife can be tracked and managed and categorized. This was something else. Mark said to me as we were returning to the vehicle, "You have heard the old stories about this place, have you not?" I said, "I do not pay attention to stories." He said, "The previous ranger 5 years ago mentioned something in his report about unusual vocalizations at night. Nothing official, just a note in the margins. It was marked down as likely wolf, though no wolves had been confirmed in the region in over 30 years. I said, "And you think that is significant?" He said, "I think it is worth being aware of. Before we start suggesting things officially that we cannot defend, I think it would be good to understand the full context of what has happened here before." Mark Thompson was not the kind of man who gave you direct answers. He preferred to let you arrive at conclusions yourself. It was an infuriating characteristic sometimes, but it was also a sign of his competence. Men like Mark Thompson did not make unfounded claims. If he was suggesting that something unusual had a history in this region, then he had good reason to suggest it. Stephanie White arrived on day 7. She was the head of our regional office, a woman of 40 with an impressive track record of managing sensitive wildlife situations. She was also politically aware in a way that the rest of us were not. She understood that suggesting the wrong thing could create the wrong kind of public attention. She examined the carcasses, reviewed all of our notes, and then she said something that I will never forget. She said, "This is a management situation, and we will manage it accordingly. I do not want speculation. I do not want stories. I want facts. Until we have enough facts to make an informed determination, we are looking at an unknown predator, likely a large bear acting abnormally. That is what we are telling the public. That is what we are putting in the official report. If anyone asks, that is what you say. Are we clear?" We were clear. We were also wrong, though none of us understood yet quite how wrong we were. I continued my regular patrol schedule, though with more caution and more awareness of my surroundings than before. The station had become a hub of activity. Additional rangers were brought in to cover more ground. Specialists were called from Juneau. Equipment was installed, including motion-sensitive cameras at likely locations. The region was being turned into something between a research facility and a staging ground for some kind of response that nobody was quite admitting we were preparing for. Stephen Harris was brought in as a behavioral consultant. He was a man of 53 who had spent decades studying large predators throughout North America. He had the kind of credentials that made his opinions difficult to dismiss and the kind of personality that made him difficult to listen to for extended periods of time. He was convinced that we were dealing with a bear. He was so convinced that he based most of his recommendations on that assumption. Stephen said during a briefing, "A mature male black bear or grizzly can reach 800 pounds. The strikes you are seeing are consistent with a wounded or isolated animal, possibly dealing with infection or disease. The extreme violence of the attacks might indicate neurological damage. This is a management situation. We find the animal, we neutralize it, we remove the body, and we move on." Mark Thompson did not argue with him, but he also did not agree. The rest of us said nothing. We had learned that saying nothing was the safest choice. It was on the night after Stephen Harris's initial briefing that the situation escalated beyond anything we had anticipated. I was alone at the station that evening. Most of the additional rangers had been rotated back out, and the specialists were staying at a temporary facility closer to Anchorage. I was finishing paperwork when the power went out. The station had backup generators, so the lights came back on within seconds. But in those seconds of darkness, I heard something. It was a sound like nothing I had heard before. It was a low-frequency vibration that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and went straight into my chest. I felt my heart skip. I felt my hands grip the desk involuntarily. When the lights came back on, the sound was gone. I checked the generator. It had cycled on perfectly. There was no fault in the system. I checked all the windows and doors. Everything was secure. I sat at the desk for the next 3 hours, unable to settle, unable to convince myself that everything was normal. At 2 in the morning, I drove my Ranger vehicle over to where Kimberly Sanchez was staying in the secondary housing. Kimberly was one of the newer Rangers, a woman of 46 with good instincts and strong nerves. I said, "Did your power go out?" She said, "About 20 minutes ago." "Why?" I said I wanted to check if it was just our section or the whole area. She said it was the whole compound. It came back on again though. I checked the backup. I did not tell her about the sound. I did not have language for it. Instead, I asked if she would return with me to the main station. She grabbed her jacket without asking questions. We drove back in silence. We were perhaps 2 kilometers from the station when Kimberly said, "There." I followed her gaze. A shape was moving through the forest parallel to the road. It was large, much larger than any bear I had ever seen. The moonlight was just enough to define its outline. It was bipedal. It was walking upright. It moved with a fluid grace that was nauseating to watch, because that grace did not belong in a body that size. As we watched, it turned its head toward the vehicle. I could not see features. I could not see eyes, but I felt the weight of observation. I felt the moment its attention focused on us. I accelerated. Kimberly did not ask me to. The shape did not attempt to pursue. It simply stood there, watching the vehicle recede into the distance. In my side mirror, I could see it turn back toward the forest and continue moving, already receding into the darkness from which it had come. We drove the rest of the way to the station in silence. When we arrived, I said, what we saw was a bear, a large bear walking on its hind legs, possibly due to an injury or behavioral issue. Kimberly said, that was not a bear. I said, that is what we are calling it. That is what it needs to be, do you understand? She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded. But we both knew what we had seen. And we both knew that the official explanation was no longer sufficient to contain the reality of what was occurring in Prince William Sound. Mark Thompson organized a systematic investigation of the area surrounding the most recent kill sites. We moved in groups of 4, always armed, always maintaining visual contact with each other. The tension was constant. Every shadow seemed to contain a threat. Every sound from the forest seemed designed to draw us deeper into the darkness. It was Andrew Clark, one of our more junior rangers, who found the structure. He was moving through a dense forest area about 5 kilometers from the main station when he reported seeing something that did not belong. His description over the radio was confused and frightened. He said, there is something here. It is not natural. I need backup. We converged on his location within 30 minutes. What we found defied easy categorization. In a clearing, surrounded by carefully placed trees that had been stripped of branches, was a structure. Not a den, not a natural shelter, a structure. It appeared to be made of branches and logs arranged in a specific geometric pattern. The entrance was perhaps 7 feet high. The construction was deliberate. The construction was intentional. Mark stood in front of it, studying the architecture with an intensity that was almost clinical. He said, this is not animal behavior. Stephen Harris said, some bears demonstrate nest-building behaviors. Mark said, bears do not build with this level of precision. Bears do not create geometric patterns. Bears do not demonstrate an understanding of structural integrity that would require this degree of planning. Nobody disagreed with him, but nobody wanted to agree with the implications either. Rebecca Ramirez, who had been brought in as a consultant on unusual animal behaviors, was taking photographs. She was a woman of 62 with a background in animal psychology and wilderness studies. She had been quiet through most of the investigation, but now she spoke up. She said, have any of you considered that this might not be a single animal? What if there are multiple entities occupying this region? What if they are coordinating? Stephen said, that would suggest a level of social organization that is not consistent with large predator behavior outside of pack animals. And we have found no evidence of wolves and no evidence of multiple animals. Rebecca said, we have found evidence of one animal that behaves in ways that are not consistent with known predator species. Is it really more difficult to imagine multiple such animals than to imagine that our baseline assumptions about animal behavior might simply be wrong? The question hung in the air, unanswered. We photographed the structure extensively. We collected samples. We set up motion sensors and cameras. Then we retreated and waited to see what would happen. The cameras recorded nothing. The motion sensors never triggered. We visited the structure again the next morning, and it was gone. The logs had been removed. The clearing had been disturbed, but not in any way that suggested an obvious direction of departure. It was as if the structure had simply been disassembled and vanished. That was the day when Stephanie White made her decision. She called all of us in for a briefing. She was standing in front of a map of Prince William Sound, marked with red circles indicating the locations of the kills and the location where we had found the structure. She said, as of this moment, we are officially closing the region to public access. All hiking trails are being marked as closed due to hazardous wildlife conditions. We are upgrading our official description of the situation from unknown predator to potential apex predator of unknown species. We are not going to say that word out loud in any official context, but I think we all understand what we might be dealing with. Moving forward, all patrols are going to be doubled. No ranger will venture into the wilderness without a partner. We are establishing a containment perimeter around the heart of the region, and we are going to continue gathering evidence until we understand exactly what it is that we are protecting these lands from. There was something in the way she said that last phrase that struck me. Protecting these lands from, not protecting these lands for. The emphasis had shifted. The entire objective of our work had inverted. We were no longer rangers dedicated to preserving a wilderness. We were now something closer to guards, stationed to contain something that the wilderness had decided to produce or harbor. Over the next 2 weeks, evidence accumulated that could not be ignored or reframed. The motion cameras captured a single frame of a shape moving past a sensor. The image was too blurred to be useful, but the size was clear. The shape was approximately 9 feet tall. The stride length was approximately 4 feet. These measurements were consistent with a bipedal creature of significant mass and height. The footage was reviewed by 3 independent experts, none of whom offered alternative explanations that were coherent. We found more structures. They were always disassembled by the time we returned to them. We collected samples from the structures, looking for DNA, for hair, for anything that might give us a genetic baseline for comparison. The samples were sent to a lab in Juneau. The results came back inconclusive. The DNA was degraded. There was not enough material for proper analysis. Kimberly Sanchez began to keep a private journal. I did not ask her to do this. She simply mentioned it one day as a way of managing the psychological strain of what we were experiencing. I understood the impulse. The ambiguity was becoming unbearable. The lack of official language for what we were dealing with was creating a psychological pressure. The journal was a way of naming things, of creating your own context, of refusing to participate in the collective denial. It was Kimberly's journal that documented the night of the encounter. She was on patrol with Andrew Clark, moving through the forested area near the sound, checking on the perimeter sensors we had installed. The night was clear. The temperature was dropping. The forest was unusually quiet. Kimberly wrote, "We heard it at 2200 hours. The sound was like nothing in my experience." Andrew described it as a roar, but it was not. It was deeper than a roar. It was a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. We followed protocol and moved toward the sound rather than away from it. We wanted to document the location, the time, the distance. We were armed, we were prepared, but nothing prepares you for direct encounter. They came upon it in a clearing near one of the kill sites. It was standing over the remains of what had been a caribou. The clearing was perhaps 40 meters across. The creature occupied the space in a way that made it seem even larger than the technical measurements had suggested. It was 8, possibly 9 feet tall. Its shoulders were broader than a bear's shoulders would be. Its posture was upright, human-like but not human. It was covered in hair, but the hair was not uniform. There were darker patches and lighter patches. The face, from what Kimberly could see, was neither ape nor human. It was a category that existed outside of those classifications. The creature looked directly at them. Then it made a sound. Not the deep vibration from before, but a sound that was clearly communicative. It was a sound with rhythm and variation. It was a sound that might have been language. Andrew raised his weapon. Kimberly said in her journal that time seemed to slow down. The creature tilted its head slightly. Then it moved. Kimberly wrote, "There was no moment of acceleration. It was simply moving. There was no moment of deceleration. It was simply gone. One moment it was present, occupying space in the clearing. The next moment we were alone. It had moved so quickly that I did not see the direction of movement. I did not see it traverse the space between us. It was there and then it was not." They secured the area and called in backup. By the time Mark Thompson and another ranger arrived, the creature was gone. The caribou carcass remained, but it had been modified. The bones had been carefully placed. The organs had been arranged in a specific pattern. It was not the work of a predator consuming its meal. It was something else. It was something that resembled ritual. That is when Mark Thompson made his decision. He pulled me aside the following morning. He said, "We need to end this. We cannot manage something that we do not understand. We cannot protect the public from something that we cannot categorize. We need to either kill it or we need to accept that it is beyond our jurisdiction." I said, "Kill it." "How would we even begin?" He said, "With the same methods we use for any animal that has become a threat. We hunt it, we find it, we remove it." I said, "What if it is not an animal?" He said, "Then we have larger problems that are not going to be solved by a park ranger and a few consultant specialists." He was right, of course, but nobody wanted to acknowledge what he was suggesting. So we continued with our patrols. We continued with our documentation. We continued with the collective pretense that this was a manageable situation. It was autumn again when it happened. The season had cycled. The darkness had deepened. I had been living in a state of sustained vigilance for months. My sleep was compromised. My ability to find anything resembling peace was gone. I was coming apart slowly, in ways that only became visible when I looked in the mirror or when someone mentioned how I looked and made me realize that I had changed in substantial ways. Stephanie White made the decision, finally. The region was officially closed. Not for management purposes, not for research, just closed. The trails were collapsed. The structures were dismantled. Most of the rangers were rotated to other posts. I was offered a choice. I could transfer, or I could remain and manage the closed zone. It was a decision without real options. If I left, I was acknowledging that this had broken me. If I stayed, I was committing myself to a situation that I did not understand. I chose to stay. The creature, or the creatures, because by then we had evidence suggesting multiple entities, largely disappeared. The kills stopped, the vocalizations ceased, the forest returned to a semblance of normal, but it was not actually normal. It was absence masquerading as normal. The absence of threat is not the same as peace. I patrolled the closed zone alone. Day after day, I walked the trails and the clearings and the places where we had found evidence of what lived there. I was waiting for something. I was not sure what. An understanding, a confrontation, a resolution. None of it came. What came instead was a growing awareness that the situation had not resolved. It had only changed states. The creature was still present, it was still watching, but it had learned to avoid us. It had learned that we were a threat that needed to be managed. It was the night before I was scheduled to leave for good, to finally accept a transfer that I had been offered 3 times over the months, that it returned. I was in my cabin, perhaps 2 kilometers from the main station, finishing the last of my personal items. I was planning to leave at dawn. I had my vehicle packed. I had my transfer papers signed. I had my exit from this place planned to the hour. I heard it first. Not the deep vibration, but a sound that was almost musical. It was a sound that might have been curiosity, or hunger, or something that had no equivalent in human emotional categories. I stepped outside the cabin. The night was clear. The stars were visible. The sound in the distance was visible as a darker absence in the darkness of the land. The creature was standing at the edge of the clearing, illuminated by starlight. It was perhaps 30 meters away. It was watching me, just watching. There was no aggression in its posture. There was no tension in its stance. It was simply present, simply observing, simply existing in the same space as I existed. I raised my weapon. My hand was steady. My intention was clear. I could shoot it. I could end this. I could provide closure and finality and solution. I could become the ranger who solved the crisis and removed the threat and restored order to the region. All of that was possible. All of that was available to me. I raised the weapon. I sighted down the barrel. I was ready. Then it made that sound again, the musical sound. And it turned and walked back into the forest. It did not run. It did not charge. It simply left. It walked back into the darkness from which it had come, and it became again absence. I lowered the weapon. I did not fire. I did not pursue. I stood in the clearing for what might have been hours, though it was probably only minutes, and I tried to understand why I had not done the thing that I was meant to do. Why I had not exercised the solution that was available to me. I think, finally, that it was because I understood something in that moment. The creature was not threatening us. It was not hostile. It was not evil. It was simply other. It was a thing that had existed in that place, in that wilderness, before we arrived. It had learned to avoid us. It had learned to minimize conflict. It had learned that we were a danger to it, just as it was a danger to us. The equilibrium that it had created was not the natural state of the wilderness, but it was an equilibrium nonetheless, and breaking it would accomplish nothing except the removal of something that had existed in that place longer than any of us had existed at all. I left the next morning. I accepted my transfer. I took a position at a different park, in a different region, where the wilderness was less complex and the creatures within it were more easily understood. But I have never stopped thinking about Prince William Sound. I have never stopped wondering about what was there. And I have never stopped believing that it is still there, still watching, still maintaining the careful balance that it has established between itself and the human world that surrounds it. This is my account. This is what happened. Whether you believe it or not is not important. What is important is that you understand that the wilderness contains things that we do not have language for. It contains possibilities that our categories and our management systems cannot accommodate. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is not to solve the problem, but to accept that some problems are not ours to solve. If you found this account interesting, if you found yourself wondering about what might be in those dark forests and those cold waters, then please join us on this channel. Subscribe so that you do not miss the next story. Leave a comment telling us which creature from American folklore you would most fear encountering in the wilderness. And please give this video a like so that more people can discover these accounts of the unknown. There is much more to tell. There are many more stories waiting in the darkness, and I intend to bring them all to you. Before you get comfortable, I need to tell you something. You know that moment when you're absolutely sure you saw something move, but everyone else swears nothing was there? That moment when your body knows something your mind refuses to accept. I spent 34 years managing protected lands across Alaska, and I learned one thing that no ranger academy teaches you. Some things in this state are still hungry, and they don't follow the rules written in our guidebooks. This is what happened when we ignored a pattern we should have seen coming. My name is unimportant. What matters is that I was the ranger overseeing the Inside Passage region during the spring of 2019, a position I'd held since the early 90s. I know these woods the way a carpenter knows wood grain. I understand the moods of the forest, the seasonal rhythms, the sounds that belong here and the ones that don't. That April, my routine shifted when the tourism board approved a new permit for independent cabin rental. 12 units scattered across the eastern ridge of the passage, each one positioned to offer guests the authentic Alaskan wilderness experience. Authentic. That word haunted me the moment I heard it. Ronald Green arrived first. 69 years old, retired orthopedic surgeon from Seattle, weathered hands that suggested he'd worked with tools before trading them for medicine. He rented cabin 7 for the entire month of April. He came alone. That detail mattered later. I met him at the ranger station when he picked up his mandatory orientation packet. Standard stuff, bear awareness, water safety, trail maps, the unofficial warnings we all learn to give without really giving them. You'll want to avoid the western trails after dark, I told him, marking an area on the map. Mountain lions are active this time of year. It wasn't a lie. Mountain lions hunt at dusk. They do hunt in April. But that wasn't why I'd marked those trails. Ronald studied the map with the careful attention of someone accustomed to detail. "How long have you worked this region?" he asked. "Since 1987. He nodded slowly. "Then you've seen things." Something in his tone suggested he wasn't asking about wildlife management statistics. I chose my next words carefully. "I've seen enough to respect boundaries that exist for a reason." Amy Baker arrived 3 days later. 51, divorced attorney from Portland, renting cabin 3 for 2 weeks. She drove a practical sedan and unpacked with military precision. She asked for the most remote location available. I gave it to her. Then came Jason Adams, the archaeologist from the University of Washington. 56, wearing hiking boots that cost more than my monthly utility bill, claiming he wanted to study the geological formations around the passage. He took cabin 9, the one positioned furthest north. He asked specific questions about overnight trail permits, about areas that hadn't been surveyed yet, about indigenous settlement patterns in the region. I should have paid more attention to his questions. I should have asked more questions in return. Julie Nelson arrived with her husband, though he stayed only a weekend. 44 years old, wildlife biographer, there to photograph migratory patterns. She said it was for a coffee table book on Alaska. She rented cabin 6, a 2-bedroom unit with large windows overlooking a clearing that had become a natural gathering point for elk herds. "Can I ask a question?" she said when she came by for her orientation. Some of the locals in the town mentioned something strange about this area. They said previous rangers wouldn't talk about certain trails. Is there anything I should know? I've thought about that moment many times since. The choice to tell her. The choice not to tell her. The difference it might have made. "Respect the forest," I told her instead. "It's more wild here than it appears." By the middle of April, the cabins were occupied. Ryan Carter, 33, a financial analyst from San Francisco who claimed he needed to disconnect from technology. Sharon Mitchell, 60 years old, a retired teacher looking for solitude after her husband died. Gary Perez, 47, who said he was writing a novel but never seemed to actually write anything, always watching instead. Laura Roberts, 39, who arrived with professional camera equipment and said she was working on a documentary about ranger life in Alaska. 8 people, 8 cabins, 1 region of forest that had learned to keep its worst secrets. The last week of April was warm, unseasonably warm. The kind of heat that makes animals restless and humans complacent. I was resupplying the northern station when I found the first sign. A trail off the main path, maybe half a mile from cabin 9 where Jason Adams was staying. The vegetation had been pushed aside, not grazed, not naturally fallen, pushed as if something large had walked directly through, unconcerned with obstacles. I followed it for 100 yards. The trail was clear, almost deliberate. Then it stopped abruptly in a small clearing where the ground showed signs of disturbance, soil turning dark from something. Not blood, something heavier. The air had changed too. That specific quality it gets when something massive has recently occupied a space, when the forest itself holds its breath around a predator. I stood there for a long time, looking at nothing specific, understanding everything. Then I walked back to my truck and made a decision that would cost 8 people their certainty about the world. I decided to watch, not to warn, not yet, just to watch. This was my first mistake. This was the first thread in a tapestry of failures that would unravel across the next month. The first incident came on May 2nd. Laura Roberts knocked on my office door at 6 in the morning. Her professional composure cracked like old paint. "There's something wrong," she said. "I need you to come to my cabin." Laura's cabin showed the signs of someone who lived carefully. Equipment organized on shelves, clothing folded precisely. A documentary filmmaker's attention to detail extended to her living space. But inside, that order had been disturbed. The back window, the one overlooking the tree line, was broken, not shattered. Broken from the inside, glass pushed outward. The frame bent as if something had forced its way through while pressing against something else. She'd been inside that cabin, on the other side of that window. "I was asleep," she said. She wasn't looking at the window anymore. She was looking at me. I heard a sound, something against the glass. When I turned on the light, I saw it moving away, into the woods. What did it look like? Huge. It was huge. Four-legged, but... She stopped. She looked at the broken window again. It stood up. When it reached the tree line, it stood up on 2 legs and walked into the forest. I wrote an incident report, possible bear encounter, advised relocation. She refused to leave. "I want to understand what that was," she said. "I need to understand." I understood something different. I understood that Laura Roberts had seen something that existed outside her previous framework of reality, and instead of running from it, she was trying to incorporate it into her understanding of the world. That impulse would eventually destroy her. 2 days later, Julie Nelson reported missing equipment. Trail cameras, motion sensors, expensive lens work. She'd been setting them up along the eastern ridges to photograph elk migration. Someone, or something, had disabled each one. Carefully, not destroyed, disabled. The positioning was deliberate. Whoever had taken the cameras had known exactly what she was documenting. They were working perfectly, she told me. I checked them at sunset. By sunrise, they were all offline. But nothing was stolen except the memory cards. The hardware is still there, just broken in precise ways. Jason Adams never reported anything. That was his tell. He visited the ranger station regularly, always asking about new survey areas, always asking if I'd noticed anything unusual, always watching my face when I answered. He'd seen the same trail I had. He knew something was there. Sharon Mitchell started leaving her cabin at unusual hours. I'd see her truck heading out at midnight, returning at 3 or 4 in the morning. When I asked if everything was fine, she gave me the smile of someone accustomed to keeping secrets. "Sleep doesn't come as easily as it used to," she said. "I drive to clear my head." Ronald Green visited my station on May 8th. He brought coffee and a specific kind of discomfort. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to consider answering honestly. When you told me about respecting the boundaries of this forest, were you speaking in general terms, or were you warning me about something specific?" He was a surgeon. He understood the importance of precision in language. He understood that I'd chosen my words carefully. "What have you experienced?" I asked, instead of answering. "Sounds. Very large sounds. Something that moves through the forest with a kind of patience that doesn't match normal animal behavior. Something that seems aware of the cabins. Something that seems to be watching." I should have told him then. I should have told all of them. Instead, I told him what ranger stations tell people. These forests are wild. That's why we manage them. Ryan Carter, the financial analyst, started drinking heavily. I could tell by the way he moved through town, by the way his eyes had that particular glassiness of someone fighting something internal. He came to my office on May 10th, already halfway through a flask he kept in his jacket pocket. "Is there really something out here?" he asked. "Because I have this sense, this overwhelming sense that something in the forest is aware of us, of me. Like I'm being cataloged." "You should consider returning to the city," I suggested. "I can't leave," he said. "I came here to see if I could still feel anything real, and I can feel this. Whatever this is, it's real, so I'm staying." Gary Perez didn't report anything, but I watched him. He sat on the porch of his cabin for hours, binoculars raised, scanning the tree line. He'd write notes, sketch diagrams, make marks on the map he'd purchased from my station. He was counting something, tracking something, recording a pattern. By the middle of May, the forest had changed. There's no other way to describe it. The same trees, the same water, the same rocks, but the quality of the air, the patterns of bird calls, the way light fell through the canopy, all of it had shifted. All 8 visitors had felt it. All 8 had responded in different ways. All 8 would remain. I received a call on May 15th from the tourism board office asking if everything was proceeding smoothly. I told them everything was fine. This was my second mistake. This was the moment I chose silence over protection. That night, I drove out to the western trail I'd warned Ronald about. I parked my truck and walked into the darkening forest with nothing but a flashlight and a profound sense of having lost control of a situation I'd never really had control over to begin with. The forest was quiet in that specific way that means something is listening. I found the clearing where I'd discovered the disturbed ground weeks before. But something had changed. The earth had been arranged, shaped into mounds, patterns that almost suggested intentionality. And scattered around the clearing, I found evidence of the wildlife cameras Julie Nelson had been setting up. They were arranged in a circle around the perimeter of the mound, all facing inward. Someone or something had wanted them to record whatever existed in the center of that circle. I stood in that clearing for 20 minutes, my flashlight beam illuminating things I wasn't prepared to understand, listening to sounds in the forest that were too large, too distant, and too aware of my presence. Then I walked back to my truck, and I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I decided that some things needed to remain undisturbed, some patterns needed to continue unchallenged, some truths needed to remain buried under the weight of silence. This was the decision that made everything that followed inevitable. The real problems began the last week of May. By then, a kind of collective understanding had settled over the cabin community without anyone actually speaking it aloud. Something was there, something substantial, something that occupied the forest the way most people occupy a room, fully present, utterly aware. Ronald Green came to my station looking thinner than he had a month before. Sickness or stress, possibly both. "How often does this area get visitors?" he asked. "Besides us, I mean. Besides the tourists and researchers." "Why?" "Because something here knows we're here. And it seems to be interested in certain people more than others. I'd like to know if there's a reason for that." I was tired by then. Tired of the half-truths. Tired of the careful non-answers. Tired of the weight of knowing something I was refusing to act upon. "What do you mean, interested in certain people?" "There are sounds at night near cabin 3, Amy Baker's cabin. Sounds like something is mapping the structure, pressing against the walls. Testing. The same pattern every night between 2 and 4 in the morning." I had nothing to tell him that wouldn't fracture the carefully constructed wall of plausible deniability I'd built. Jason Adams disappeared from his cabin on May 27th. He didn't check out. He didn't return to the ranger station. His truck remained parked outside cabin 9, and his equipment, his clothing, everything remained inside, arranged carefully on the shelves. The official report listed him as missing. A routine search was initiated. Nothing was found. The ranger station was contacted by the university. Statements were taken. The case was filed in that particular bureaucratic limbo where people go when they vanish into remote terrain. What the reports didn't record was that Jason Adams had left a note on the kitchen table of his cabin, a single sentence written on a piece of notepaper. "It wants what I came looking for. I'm giving it freely." I found that note when I searched his cabin, and I burned it. This was my third mistake. This was when I moved from silence into active conspiracy with whatever was happening in that forest. The activity intensified after Jason disappeared. Not increased. Intensified. The same sounds, but with a different quality, as if something had been released from a kind of restraint. Between May 28th and June 1st, we received reports of strange activity at 5 of the remaining 7 cabins. Sharon Mitchell reported hearing what sounded like massive footsteps circling her cabin. Deliberate footsteps. She'd counted 47 complete circuits on the second night. She'd recorded the sounds on her phone. When she played them for me, I could hear the pattern Jason Adams had apparently found. A rhythm, a counting, a kind of communication expressed through movement. Gary Perez finally showed me his notebook. Pages filled with sketches, diagrams, annotations. He'd been mapping the locations of every unusual occurrence, every sound, every pattern. His map showed a network of trails converging at specific points throughout the forest. And at the center of that network was the clearing where I'd found the rearranged earth months before. "What is it?" he asked me, his filmmaker's eye desperate for explanation. "What lives here?" I told him what I'd managed to avoid admitting to anyone else. Something that was here before the cabins. Something that will be here after. Something that the forest acknowledges in a way it doesn't acknowledge us. Julie Nelson had stopped trying to document through cameras. Instead, she'd started hiking deeper into the wilderness, following sounds, tracking patterns. She showed me photographs from her expeditions, trees marked in ways that suggested intention, pathways that seemed to have been created deliberately, and photographs of something massive, always at the edge of the frame, always moving away. Hair the color of old rust, a shape that stood sometimes on 4 legs, sometimes on 2, something that seemed to exist at the boundary of what her lens could fully capture. "That's Bigfoot," she said simply. "That's what's here. That's what's been here." The word hung in the ranger station like a name for madness. Bigfoot, a legend, folklore, a creature that belonged in documentary shows and campfire stories, not in the actual forest where 8 people were currently living in an increasing state of fear and confusion. "I don't believe that," Ryan Carter said when the rumor reached him. He said it with the specific desperation of someone trying to convince himself. There has to be a logical explanation, but there wasn't. There was only the forest, and the thing in the forest, and 8 people who'd come looking for something real and found something too real to accept. Laura Roberts' documentary footage started becoming public around this time. She'd been recording everything, uploading files to a secure server in case something happened to her. She was a filmmaker, and what she was capturing was the most important thing she'd ever filmed. Video after video. Night vision footage of something massive moving past her cabin. Audio recordings of sounds that no known animal could make. Photographs of indentations in the earth that suggested footprints the size of snowshoes. The tourism board started getting calls. News outlets started investigating. The state wildlife division opened an official inquiry. And through it all, Ronald Green sat in his cabin, getting thinner, knowing something the rest of us were still working toward understanding. On June 3rd, he asked to see me one more time. "I've been thinking about why I came here," he said. We were standing on the porch of the ranger station, looking out toward the forest. "I spent my entire life cutting into people, repairing what was broken, controlling what was damaged. I came here looking for something I couldn't control, something that wouldn't accept my expertise." "And what did you find?" I asked. "Exactly what I was looking for. I found something wild, something that operates according to rules I don't understand and can't change, and in a strange way that's made me feel more alive than I've felt in years." He paused, looking directly at me. "But I'm afraid," he continued, "because I think that thing in the forest understands what I was looking for, and I think it understands that I'm willing to let it find me." 3 days later, Ronald Green was gone. His cabin was empty. His truck remained. His belongings were still there, carefully arranged, almost like a memorial. And in the kitchen, on the table, he'd left a note identical to the one Jason Adams had left. "It wants what I came looking for. I'm giving it freely. I should have stopped this. I should have evacuated the cabins. I should have closed the permit. I should have done 100 things different from that moment forward. Instead, I did nothing. I let the pattern continue. I let the remaining 5 people stay in their cabins. I watched the forest come alive with something we'd been taught to dismiss as impossible, and I said nothing." By June 8th, the remaining 5 people had started communicating with the thing in the forest in their own ways. They left food outside their cabins, which was consumed. They posted messages on trees which seemed to be read based on the way they were marked after. They played music at specific times, and sometimes the forest would respond with sounds that suggested an attempt at communication. Broken, distorted, but unmistakably intentional. Gary Perez had stopped thinking of it as a creature. He'd started thinking of it as a neighbor that was slowly becoming more aware of us, a neighbor that was learning to speak our language, a neighbor that was beginning to make demands. By the middle of June, the forest had become something I no longer recognized. The missing ranger report on Jason Adams had been officially closed. Ronald Green's disappearance was being investigated, but quietly, because the official story didn't accommodate what was clearly happening in the inside passage. Laura Roberts requested that I accompany her on an expedition to the central clearing. She wanted my official documentation of what we might find there. Against my better judgment, against everything my 27 years of experience told me, I agreed. We set out on June 15th with recording equipment, documentation materials, and a kind of grim resolve. The forest felt different in daylight, not safer, different, watchful. Every shadow suggested presence, every sound suggested intelligence. The path to the clearing had become well defined by then. Not a human-made trail, but something that had been marked repeatedly, traveled, shaped by significant weight. We followed it in silence for over an hour, climbing through terrain that became increasingly steep and isolated. The clearing opened up suddenly, and what we found there changed the way I understood the forest forever. The earth had been arranged into patterns, concentric circles, spirals, shapes that seemed to follow some kind of mathematical progression. But this time, the patterns had advanced. There were structures, not buildings but arrangements. Branches had been woven together to create shapes that almost suggested architecture. Stones had been moved to form what might have been sitting areas or observation points, and at the very center there was a structure that I still struggle to describe. A cone of branches and earth, roughly 12 feet tall, with an opening that suggested it was hollow. The opening faced the direction of Cabin 9, where Jason Adams had been staying. "Someone's been building here," Laura said, her voice steady with that professional distance documentarians use when they're terrified. "Recently. This would have taken weeks of continuous work, but the thing that truly affected me was the arrangement of objects within the spiral patterns. Items that matched descriptions of things that Jason Adams had brought to his cabin. His notebook, his hiking boots, arranged in a specific pattern, like an offering or like a map. "He guided it here," Laura said. "He showed it what it was looking for." Around the perimeter of the clearing, at regular intervals, were trees that had been marked, not carved. Marked, gouged with something heavy enough to tear through bark and leave marks on the wood beneath. The marks formed a pattern, a boundary, something that suggested containment or perhaps something more sinister. A suggestion of ownership. We documented everything. Photographs, video, audio recordings. And when we left that clearing, neither of us spoke about what we'd really found. Not a home, a territory. Not a temporary dwelling, but a permanent installation. Something that had organized space according to its own rules, in its own way, for reasons we could only speculate about. The real discovery came when Laura reviewed her documentation later that evening. In the background of several photographs of the central structure there was a massive silhouette, not clearly defined, but unmistakably present, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us work, documenting our documentation. It had been there the entire time. It had allowed us to see what it had built. It had permitted us to record it, and it had been recording us in return. By June 20th, Sharon Mitchell had stopped leaving her cabin. She'd begun communicating through written messages left at specific locations in the forest. Julie Nelson found herself unable to leave. She'd tried on 3 separate occasions to drive out, and each time she found the road blocked by fallen trees that hadn't been there moments before. Not deliberately placed, just present in her way. Gary Perez's documentary footage and notes had begun circulating among a small group of paranormal researchers and cryptozoologists. The existence of the Inside Passage situation was becoming public knowledge, though the official channels denied everything. The State Wildlife Division continued its investigation into Ronald Green's disappearance. Rangers were assigned to the area, experts were brought in, and the forest simply waited. The thing in the forest simply continued its work. I received a visit on June 22nd from a person I'll call the investigator. He was official. He wore the kind of badge that didn't come from any civilian agency. He came to my station with photographs, documents, and a specific kind of understanding. "How long have you known about this?" he asked, spreading photographs across my desk. They showed the clearing, the structures, the patterns, but they also showed historical photographs of the same area, dating back 40 years. The patterns were consistent, the structures remained. The territory had been marked the same way for decades. "Long enough," I told him. "And how many people do you estimate are still alive out there?" The way he phrased it suggested he already knew the answer. 4, I said. "Possibly 5. I haven't been able to make direct contact with Sharon Mitchell in 3 days." He nodded, unsurprised. "They won't leave, will they?" "No, because they understand that something here wants them. And they've decided that being wanted is the realest thing that's happened to them in years." He packed up his photographs. "The state is going to recommend that the Inside Passage be closed to tourists for the next 2 years. We're going to suggest wildlife management initiatives. We're going to create a containment narrative that will eventually fade into the background of public consciousness. And the people still in the cabins? They're going to disappear into the very narrative we create. Missing hikers, wilderness accidents, tragic stories, but ultimately acceptable losses in the management of remote territories." "What about the thing in the forest?" He stood up to leave. "That thing was here before we existed as a species. It will be here after we're extinct. We don't manage it, we accommodate it. We maintain the boundaries it establishes, and we accept that some parts of this world aren't meant for us to fully understand." He left my station, and I understood that the official response to the Inside Passage was to let it happen. To observe, to document, to maintain the story that nothing remarkable was actually occurring. The last direct encounter I had with any of the remaining cabin residents happened on June 28th. Julie Nelson appeared at my station in the early morning, something fragile in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I need someone to know." We sat in my office, and she told me about the dreams. They'd started in early June. In these dreams, she wasn't herself. She was something massive, moving through forest that she understood on a cellular level, marking trees that sang to her, following scent paths that told stories. "I'm becoming something," she said. "I don't know how to explain it better than that. Every night, I dream in a way that feels more real than this." She gestured around the ranger station. "And every morning I wake up a little less convinced that my life before this was actually real." "You should leave," I told her. "You need to leave today." "I can't. I don't want to. That's the thing that terrifies me. I don't want to leave." She stayed for another hour, talking about the photographs she'd taken, how they'd started to show things that she hadn't consciously seen, details in the background that suggested intelligence, patterns in the forest that seemed to acknowledge her presence, a kind of communication that operated on levels beneath language. "It's teaching me," she said. "Every day it's teaching me to see the forest the way it sees the forest. And once I start seeing that way, I won't be able to go back." I wanted to tell her that none of this was real, that it was stress and isolation and the power of the human mind to create narratives from incomplete information. But I'd seen the clearing. I'd felt the intelligence in that forest, and I couldn't lie to her anymore. Instead, I asked, "Do you want to go back?" She met my eyes directly. "No. I think I came here looking for something real to believe in, and I found it. Even if it's impossible, even if it requires me to become someone I don't recognize, at least it will be real." She left my station and drove back toward her cabin. I never saw her again, though I continued to receive occasional photographs and documentation left at specific drop points in the forest. Pictures of the clearing, more developed now, pictures of tracks, and in the most recent ones, pictures of something that might have been a figure, large and powerful and utterly unlike anything that should exist in the taxonomy of known creatures. Gary Perez's final documentary submission arrived on June 30th. He'd compiled everything, all the footage, all the audio, all the evidence, into a single coherent narrative. He'd titled it simply, "Inside Passage, A Study in Acceptance." In an accompanying letter, he explained that he was remaining in the cabin voluntarily, that he'd come to understand the thing in the forest not as a threat, but as an educator, a force that existed to teach people like him, people who came seeking authenticity, what authentic wildness actually meant. "Authenticity," he wrote, "is something that humans are fundamentally afraid of. We want it, but only in the ways we can control it. We want nature, but only in the forms we've decided are acceptable. But there is a wildness that exists beyond our acceptable parameters. There is a reality that operates according to rules we didn't write and can't change. And if we're very brave or very desperate, we can choose to accept that reality on its own terms." He included instructions for his documentary to be uploaded to multiple servers, ensuring its survival regardless of what happened to him. Then his letter ended simply, "I've decided that I'm ready to understand." Sharon Mitchell left her cabin on July 3rd. She drove directly to my station and requested official documentation of her departure. She was thinner than she'd been, her eyes clearer than they'd been in months. When I asked her where she was going, she simply said, "Home. But I'm taking something with me." "What do you mean?" "I mean that everything I experienced here, everything I learned about myself in relation to something genuinely wild, that doesn't leave me, I carry it. It's changed me permanently." She drove away, and I documented her departure in the official records as straightforward evacuation due to mental health concerns. No mention of what she'd actually witnessed. No documentation of the truth. By early July, only Ryan Carter remained in the cabins. He'd stopped responding to my check-ins. His cabin remained secured, his vehicle parked outside. When I finally managed to force entry on July 7th, I found him sitting on the back porch, staring out at the forest. He was thinner than the photographs from his arrival would suggest. His eyes had taken on a specific quality that I recognized from my other observations. A clarity that comes from accepting something that can't be accepted. A peace that comes from surrendering to something larger than yourself. "How long?" I asked him. "Since June 10th, he said. I stopped being able to look at the forest and see it the way it appears to normal people. I see what's underneath. I see the intelligence. I see the intention. and I can't unsee it. We need to get you out of here. I am out of here. I left 3 weeks ago. This is just what's left of my body while the important part of me went somewhere else. I contacted emergency medical services. They found him unresponsive, showing signs of severe malnutrition, his mind unable or unwilling to maintain connection with the world I occupied. He was transported to a facility in Juneau. He remains there, unresponsive, occasionally responding to specific forest sounds or animal vocalizations with a focused intensity that his caregivers find both remarkable and inexplicable. It's been 3 years now. I'm still the ranger managing the Inside Passage region, though the permit program for private cabin rentals has been permanently suspended. Official investigations concluded that the situation was caused by environmental stress, isolation, and the power of suggestion. No creature was ever documented. No evidence was ever definitively recorded. But if you know where to look, if you understand what you're seeing, the documentation exists. The photographs, the video footage, the audio recordings, the testimonies of 8 people who came to a remote forest looking for something real and found something that rewrote their understanding of reality itself. I visit the clearing sometimes, not often. Once every season, just to maintain my own verification that it's still there. The structures remain, the patterns continue to develop, and occasionally I find evidence of occupation, arrangements of natural materials, markings on trees that seem to follow a mathematical progression, communications that operate beyond language. I've asked myself many times if I should have prevented this, if I should have evacuated the cabins earlier, forbidden entry to those 8 people, protected them from the consequences of their own curiosity. But I've come to understand that each of them came to this place because some part of their consciousness recognized what existed here. The forest called to them on a frequency beneath language, and they responded. Jason Adams wanted to understand ancient knowledge. Ronald Green wanted to find something that couldn't be controlled. Julie Nelson wanted to document genuine wildness. Gary Perez wanted to capture authenticity. Laura Roberts wanted to film something that would force her to exceed her previous understanding. Sharon Mitchell wanted to feel alive again. Ryan Carter wanted to feel anything real. Amy Baker wanted to understand something that operated according to rules different from the laws she'd spent her life interpreting. Each of them came looking for something specific, and the forest, through the intelligence that lives there, gave them exactly what they came seeking. I've also understood that my role in this wasn't to prevent it, but to witness it, to acknowledge it, to maintain through my silence the sacred boundary between the world humans believe they understand and the world that exists beyond our categories of understanding. The thing in the forest is still out there. It's still marking its territory. It's still learning to communicate through the world of humans. And sometimes, I wonder if it's waiting for something, if it's preparing, if it's slowly accumulating an understanding of us that will eventually allow it to step fully into the world we inhabit. I don't know if that's something to fear or something to accept, but I know this. 6 of the 8 people who came to the Inside Passage are no longer part of the conventional world. 2 have officially disappeared. 1 remains in a mental health facility, unresponsive and untouchable. 2 have reintegrated into normal life, but with knowledge that will never allow them to fully belong to that life again. And 1 remains in the forest, documenting, recording, accepting, transforming. If you're watching this, if you're listening to this story, I want you to understand something fundamental about the world you think you know. There are places on this earth where what we've learned to believe about reality doesn't apply. There are creatures that exist beyond our categories of understanding. There are forms of intelligence that operate according to rules that predate human consciousness. And sometimes, if we're very brave or very desperate, we find our way into those places and into the awareness of those minds. And when we do, we're forever changed in ways we can never fully articulate to anyone who hasn't experienced it. I've kept my silence about this for 3 years. I've allowed the official narrative to persist. I've maintained the boundaries between what's officially real and what I know to be true. But I'm telling you now because something has changed. Because I found a marking on a tree near my station yesterday. A marking that corresponds to a message left 3 years ago, left by someone in the forest. A message that translates approximately to this: it is ready. We are ready. The boundary between your world and this one is becoming thin. Prepare for what comes next. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it's a threat or an invitation. I don't know if the 8 people who came to this place were chosen as preparation for something larger, but I know this. The thing in the Inside Passage is changing. It's becoming something new. And soon, very soon, the rest of the world might have to acknowledge that we're not alone in this wilderness. That something vast and intelligent and utterly unconcerned with human definitions of reality shares this land with us. And when that happens, I hope people will remember this story. I hope they'll understand that some of us already knew, that some of us chose silence as an act of respect, that some of us understood that the wildest, truest things in this world operate beyond our permission or our understanding. Thank you for listening, for believing, for accepting this story when logic and science tell you it can't be true. Please share this, tell others, and when the official investigations continue and the denials persist, remember that 8 real people found something in the inside passage that changed them forever. Like this video. Comment with your hometown and what you'd encounter if something ancient lived in your local forests. Subscribe to the channel for more stories from places where the world doesn't work the way official sources claim it does. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay aware of the boundaries between the world we've been taught and the world that exists beneath it. Something was singing in the forest behind the Tlingit protocols I thought I understood. Something was singing, and the elders had never taught us what to do when the song came from where it should not come from. The year was 2019 when I stopped being able to sleep through the night. The year was 2019 when I learned that protecting a park means understanding that some visitors are not welcome, and some boundaries exist because our ancestors understood what happens when they break. I am writing this because the official report says nothing. The official record contains no answers. The families of Gregory Rivera, Hannah Cooper, Frank Richardson, Martha Cox, Zachary Howard, Deborah Ward, Scott Torres, and Pamela Peterson have questions that the government will never answer, and I cannot carry the weight of that silence anymore. What I am about to tell you happened in the traditional territories of the Tlingit people. What happened there has been happening for longer than the park existed. What happened there will continue happening long after I am finished speaking. The morning they assigned me to Tongass National Forest Patrol was the morning my grandmother called me at 6 minutes past dawn. She did not say hello. She said only that the salmon runs were moving strange that summer and that the ravens had stopped calling from the eastern ridge. I told her I had been training for 3 years to earn this position. I told her that to be a park ranger meant something in my family. My grandfather had guided hikers, had maintained trails, had held the responsibility of keeper. My father had done the same until arthritis took his hands. She told me that her mother had instructed her about the boundaries, that her mother had explained which valleys should remain closed, that the old knowledge was not superstition but observation. 5 generations of Tlingit keepers had watched this place. We did not go into the northeastern sector without ceremony. We did not camp alone in the area near the old settlement sites. We did not ignore the signs when the forest began to speak in ways that suggested it wanted silence. I was 28 years old. I believed in government management practices and ecological zones and trail maintenance schedules. I did not understand then that my grandmother was not warning me about wildlife encounters. She was warning me about what happened when the boundaries of the old protocols became merely geographic suggestions. The park hired me on a Tuesday. They assigned me the southeast quadrant as my primary patrol region. They provided me with a radio that barely functioned in the steep valleys, a map that did not reflect the actual traditional territories, and the assurance that the only large predators in the region were black bears and occasionally brown bears from the northern territories. On my 3rd day, Gregory Rivera became the first missing hiker. He was 66 years old. He had come to Alaska with his wife Hannah Cooper, who was 36. They had married late in life, which caused certain conversations among the other rangers, conversations that reflected assumptions I found distasteful. Hannah had wanted to photograph waterfalls. Gregory had wanted to improve his cardiovascular fitness. Together they had wanted to walk into the Tongass as visitors from California who believed that Alaska was a destination where things could be resolved through sufficient determination and proper hiking gear. I was not there when they started their walk. I was at the ranger station, learning how to file reports and understanding that my role was not to be a keeper in the way my grandfather understood it, but to be an administrator of permits and enforcer of regulations that had nothing to do with what the forest actually required. By the time the search began, Gregory had been missing for 18 hours. Hannah was found at mile marker 1.8 on the Perseverance Trail, sitting on a boulder with her jacket removed. She was breathing but not conscious. Her fingernails were broken. Her palms were bleeding from something that appeared to be climbing or gripping or attempting to hold on to something that refused to be held. When she woke, she said Gregory had heard something calling. She said he had followed the sound. She said she had called after him and received no response except the same sound, now coming from a different direction. She said the sound had been almost human, almost like words, almost like someone calling his name, but not quite right. Like someone saying his name through water or through stone or through something that was not intended by nature to produce human speech. That is what she told the search team. That is what I read in the preliminary report. What she told me when I came to interview her at the medical facility in Ketchikan was something different. Hannah Cooper sat in a wheelchair with a blanket on her legs despite the warmth of the room. She had been hospitalized for 4 days. The physical examination had revealed no injuries except the hands. The psychological evaluation had determined she was experiencing acute stress response and potential dissociative episodes. The recommendations included medication and therapy and avoidance of the location for at least 6 months. I asked her to describe the sound again. I asked her specifically whether it had seemed to be coming from an animal, whether it had seemed to be a call of alarm or distress or hunting behavior. She said the sound had been too large to be an animal, too intentional, too aware. She said that when Gregory had gone into the trees, she had heard him say something, that from where she stood, she had heard him say words that suggested recognition, words that suggested he understood what he was hearing, and that this understanding had made him willing to follow it deeper. Words that suggested whatever he had recognized, he had believed it was something that wanted to communicate with him specifically. She said his words had been the last sound he had made that came from his own throat. I asked what she meant by that. She looked at me for a long time. Long enough that I understood she was trying to decide whether speaking the truth would be a burden I could carry or whether it would simply add my name to the list of people who had heard what she had heard and been changed by it. She said that as she waited on that boulder, as she called into the forest after Gregory, she had heard him call back. Not immediately, not close, but eventually. From deeper and deeper into the trees, always at a distance that would have required significant movement through dense forest in a short amount of time. She said he had called her name, repeatedly, with increasing urgency, with sounds that came from a distance that made no geographic sense given the time elapsed and the difficulty of the terrain. She said by the end, by the point at which she had stopped responding and simply sat on the boulder with her hands gripping the stone until the blood began to flow, the voice calling her name had sounded less and less like Gregory and more like something that had heard Gregory call and was practicing his name, learning it, perfecting it, trying it in different ways to see which version would make her follow into the trees the way he had followed. Frank Richardson arrived at Tongass National Forest as a contractor 2 weeks after Gregory Rivera disappeared. He was 58 years old. He had been hired to assess the structural integrity of the bridge system that crossed through the northeastern sector. He had experience with deteriorating infrastructure in remote locations. He had no experience with Tlingit protocols or indigenous warnings or the specific way that knowledge can be encoded in family stories and then dismissed by government permits. I was instructed to assist with his survey. I was instructed to ensure site security and manage any potential wildlife encounters. I was not instructed to tell him what my grandmother had said, because my superiors did not believe in protocol that came from sources that could not be peer-reviewed. The bridges in question were old. They had been built in the 1960s by contractors who had not consulted the Tlingit tribal authorities. They had been maintained by a series of rangers, some of whom understood the significance of the northeastern sector and some of whom did not. The newest bridge, constructed in the 1980s, had been built explicitly to open a trail system that the Tlingit Council had requested remain closed. My grandmother's mother had been on that council. She had explained then that the northeastern sector had a relationship with the forest that could not be managed by non-indigenous protocols, that the boundaries that kept people out of those valleys were not restrictions based on resource preservation, but restrictions based on balance, that something lived in those valleys that required uninterrupted territory, that the Tlingit people had learned over generations what it meant to respect that requirement. The council had not prevailed. The bridge had been built, the trail had been opened, the park had been expanded. Frank Richardson did not look like someone who worried about such things. He looked like someone who looked at infrastructure and saw only infrastructure. He looked at bridges and saw only bridges. When I mentioned during our first morning of work that the area had been kept closed under tribal agreement for specific reasons, he said that such decisions were above his pay grade. He said his job was to assess steel and wood and concrete. His job was not to police cultural boundaries. I should have insisted. I should have found a way to make it clear to him that the work needed to stop. I should have called my grandmother and explained that I was not strong enough to resist the systems that had been built to override the knowledge that my family carried. I did not do any of these things. I convinced myself that I was only supporting his work. I was only following instructions. I was only doing the job that paid my rent and allowed me to maintain my employment. Frank Richardson died on the fourth day of the survey. He died in the manner that a person dies when they have been pulled through a space that their body was not constructed to fit through. His remains were discovered suspended between two sections of railing on the northeastern bridge, in a position that required him to have been lifted and repositioned after the initial trauma. The official report described it as a fall. The official report could not explain the angle of the brakes or the depth of the claw marks or why his camera contained photographs of something that none of the wildlife specialists in 3 states could identify. In the photographs, there was a shape in the trees. The shape was dark. The shape was very tall. The shape was in the background of 5 consecutive pictures that Frank had taken while surveying the bridge supports. The shape had moved between the first and final photograph, covering a distance that appeared to be several hundred feet. The shape had become progressively closer to the photographer with each subsequent image. The official assessment was that the camera had been damaged and the images corrupted. The official assessment was that a bear stood on hind legs in the images and that the apparent movement was an optical artifact created by the angle of the terrain and the poor quality of the image compression. I knew better. I knew what I was looking at when I reviewed those photographs alongside the forensic data. I knew that what had happened to Frank Richardson had happened before. I knew that what had happened to Frank Richardson would happen again. What I did not know was how many other families would need to lose someone before the government decided that certain boundaries existed for reasons that transcended budget allocations and development goals. Martha Cox came to Tongass in the capacity of an environmental assessment specialist. She was 48 years old. She had credentials from major universities. She had published papers on forest ecosystems and wildlife management and the best practices for sustainable timber operations. She did not have credentials in Tlingit history or indigenous knowledge systems. She did not have credentials in understanding that some things in the forest had been negotiated with by the Tlingit people over hundreds of years and that these negotiations required specific protocols. She knew how to assess trees. She did not know that some forests are not mere collections of trees but communities with their own borders and requirements. Martha Cox was assigned to the region to conduct a comprehensive environmental review. This review was supposedly necessary to determine whether the timber operation permits should be renewed. Supposedly this review was meant to be rigorous and complete. What the review was actually intended to do was provide justification for operations that the government had already decided to expand. I was assigned to her team. I was assigned to help her navigate the terrain and manage her safety. I was not assigned to question her methodology or her conclusions or her right to be conducting the assessment in an area where 2 people had already died in circumstances that defied official explanation. Martha Cox was a methodical person. She took careful notes. She marked trees with paint. She measured soil composition and water pH and the density of undergrowth. She collected samples. She documented everything with the precision of someone who believed that attention to detail was the same thing as understanding truth. I watched her work in the northeastern sector for 5 days. I watched her conduct her survey with increasing confidence, as if the sheer accumulation of data points was proof that the forest was knowable. I watched her believe that if she simply collected enough information, she would be able to explain everything, including the circumstances of Gregory Rivera and Frank Richardson. On the 5th afternoon, Martha asked me to explain the significance of the old settlement pattern in the valley. She had noticed signs of previous habitation, stone arrangements that suggested intentional placement, locations that seemed to follow particular geographic principles rather than random distribution. I told her that the Tlingit people had used these valleys for thousands of years, that the arrangement of settlements reflected understanding of salmon runs, of seasonal movement, of where it was safe to winter and where it was dangerous to remain. Martha asked me why it would be dangerous to remain. She asked me to explain what threat would have been so significant that the entire seasonal use pattern of a valley would be determined by avoidance of a specific location. She asked me if I could point out on a map exactly which areas had been traditionally avoided and why. I could have answered her. My grandmother's mother could have answered her if she had been willing to travel from her home in Juneau and participate in an interview that would never be believed anyway. Instead, I said that the information was complex and came from traditional sources that were not easily documented in academic terms. I said that some knowledge was not transferable to people from outside the community. I said that I understood if this was frustrating, but that respect sometimes meant accepting that certain information was not accessible to everyone. and that this was not a limitation of the knowledge but a protection of it. Martha nodded. She said she understood. She said she would read more about Tlingit protocols and would respect the boundaries of traditional knowledge. She said she appreciated my honesty. She said she would complete her assessment without requiring answers to the questions I could not answer. I believed that I had protected her through careful silence. I believed that I had done the right thing. I was wrong about both of those things. Martha was found 3 days later, near the site of an old fish camp that had not been inhabited for approximately 250 years. She was found partially submerged in a pool of water that had no known source and no apparent outlet. The water was extraordinarily deep for a location so close to the surface. The depth suggested either geological conditions that no survey had ever identified or something that should not have been possible in that location. Martha was still alive when the search team found her. She was alive but not responsive. She was breathing but not speaking. She was maintaining consciousness but not participating in the world. The specialists who examined her determined that she had experienced severe physical trauma. The trauma suggested that she had been picked up, held, subjected to force applied from multiple directions simultaneously. The marks on her body indicated contact with something other than human hands, something with significantly larger surface area, something with strength enough to break ribs without breaking the skin. Martha died 5 days later in the hospital in Ketchikan. She died without speaking a word. She died with her eyes open and focused on something that none of the medical personnel in the room could see. She died with her hands clenched so tightly that the fingernails had grown into the palms and drawn blood. The autopsy revealed that she had not drowned. She had not suffocated. She had not sustained injuries that should have been lethal. What she had sustained was damage to her nervous system that could not be explained by any mechanism that the pathologist had encountered. The report indicated that it was as if her brain had been subjected to electrical shock of a type and magnitude that had no explanation within conventional understanding. I requested a transfer. I requested it formally and privately and with careful documentation. I explained that I was having difficulty with the work environment. I explained that I believed the region required supervisors with different training than I possessed. I explained that I felt the assignment was not appropriate for my skill set and that I believed a transfer would be beneficial to both my career and the mission of the park. My request was denied. The response came from a supervisor in Juneau who explained that transfers during active administrative investigations were inappropriate. The response explained that my presence in the region was valuable to the ongoing assessment of circumstances. The response explained that no pattern had been established to suggest that the location itself was the variable in any of these incidents. I wanted to tell them that my grandmother had called me after Martha Cox's death. I wanted to tell them that she had wept while on the phone with me. I wanted to tell them that she had explained that the forest had been warning us for generations, that the protocols existed because something old lived in the northeastern sector. Something that had made a bargain with the Tlingit people hundreds of years ago. Something that required the valleys to remain undisturbed. Something that had been patient while we built bridges and trails and conducted assessments. Something that had begun to lose its patience. I did not tell them any of these things because I knew how they would be received. I knew that indigenous knowledge would be classified as anecdotal. I knew that my grandmother's understanding would be classified as cultural narrative. I knew that none of it would matter in the context of a government report. Instead, I went back to work. I continued my patrols. I filed my paperwork. I did everything I was supposed to do while the thing in the forest did what it had apparently decided it was going to do. Zachary Howard arrived at Tongass during the middle of the investigation into Martha Cox's death. He was 30 years old. He was an ornithologist working on a research project related to the breeding patterns of specific bird species in old-growth forest. He was interested in the northeastern sector specifically because his preliminary data suggested unusual population density in that area. I warned him. I told him directly that the northeastern sector was not safe. I told him that people had died. I told him that regardless of what the official reports claimed, the deaths had happened in that specific location, and that location had characteristics that made it dangerous in ways that were not reflected in standard wildlife assessment protocols. He asked me what I was warning him about. He asked me whether I was suggesting that there was a dangerous predator in the region that had not been officially classified. He asked me whether I was warning him based on evidence or based on something else. I said something else. I said that I could not articulate the exact nature of the danger. I said that I was asking him to trust that the warning existed for reasons that would become clear if he ignored it. I said that in Tlingit culture, some warnings came from observation so old and careful that the specific reasons were embedded in the structure of the families that held the knowledge, and that my role in the family placed me in a position to give this warning. Zachary Howard said that he respected indigenous knowledge, but that he could not allow culturally based warnings to prevent him from conducting scientifically important research. He said that the data would be useful to conservation efforts. He said that the location of high bird population density was significant enough to warrant in-person assessment. He said these things with no hostility. He said them with genuine respect. He said them with the complete confidence of someone who believed that if he was careful and aware and attentive to his surroundings, he would be able to conduct his research without incident. The birds in the northeastern sector had disappeared 3 days before Zachary died. My grandmother called me to tell me this. She said that the silence in the forest was worse than the noise because it meant something significant was about to occur. She said that the Tlingit people had a story about what happens when the birds stop singing in particular locations. She said that I should go and remove him from the area while it was still possible to do so. I could not remove him. I could not prevent his work. I could not do anything except wait. When they found Zachary Howard, they found him in a tree. They found him 70 feet above the ground on a branch that had begun to grow around his body. The branch had begun to fuse with his jacket. The bark was beginning to conform to his shape. If they had not found him when they did, if the search had taken another 2 or 3 weeks, it is possible that he would have been absorbed entirely into the tree structure. It is possible that his body would have become part of the wood itself. He was alive when they brought him down. He was alive but completely rigid. He was alive but unable to move or speak or respond to stimuli. He was alive but not present in any way that was meaningful to the people attempting to rescue him. He died in transport to the hospital. He died during the helicopter flight. He died with no medical explanation for how his body had become so rigid that his bones began to break from the physical stress of movement. Deborah Ward was a social worker. She was 53 years old. She had come to the region to investigate the circumstances surrounding the deaths of multiple individuals in an extremely compressed time frame. She had come as a representative of a private concern. She had come because the families of the deceased had retained legal counsel to investigate whether negligence or misconduct had occurred. She was the first person other than myself to explicitly state that the location was the common variable in all the deaths. She was the first person to suggest that all of the deaths had occurred in the northeastern sector specifically. She was the first person to ask me directly whether I believed the location itself was dangerous and whether the government was aware of that danger and had decided to proceed with development and research and assessment activities despite that awareness. I said yes. I said yes to all of it. I said that I believed the location was dangerous in a manner that exceeded standard wildlife management protocols. I said that I believed the government was proceeding with development activities despite awareness that the location was incompatible with human habitation or activity. I said that I believed this was happening because the profit margins associated with timber operations and research contracts exceeded the cost calculations associated with human death. I should have realized that speaking the truth to someone with legal standing was tantamount to painting a target on myself. I should have understood that saying these things out loud, in a recorded interview, in a manner that could be documented and preserved and used in legal proceedings was a different level of transgression than simply living with the knowledge silently. Deborah Ward spent 14 hours in the northeastern sector. She spent that time conducting interviews with local residents. She spent that time reviewing geographic data and death certificates and hospital records. She spent that time attempting to establish a documentation trail that would definitively connect the location to the incidents. She disappeared during the early evening of the second day. Her vehicle was found on the access road. Her equipment was found in the forest. Her body has never been found. What was found instead was a recording on her digital device. The recording contained 4 hours of ambient sound from the forest. The recording contained no human speech. The recording contained no indication of Deborah's presence. What the recording contained instead was a series of sounds that the specialists who analyzed it could not classify. The sounds were rhythmic. The sounds were patterned. The sounds were structured in a way that suggested either sophisticated audio editing or a source that was creating patterns rather than simply making noise. The sounds were almost musical, almost like language, almost like something was using the forest itself as the medium for communication. In the background of the recording, if you listened to the correct section at the correct volume level with the correct kind of attention, it was possible to hear something else. It was possible to hear Deborah Ward's voice. It was possible to hear her speaking her own name repeatedly. It was possible to hear her practicing different inflections and emphases, as if she was learning how to say her own name from someone else, as if something was teaching her to do so, as if something was keeping her alive long enough to learn the process and then was showing her what she sounded like when she said her own name the way that it needed to be said. Scott Torres and Pamela Peterson were tourists. They were 46 and 64 years old, respectively. They were not connected to any of the official operations in the region. They were simply two people who had come to Tongass National Forest because they had read online reviews that described it as one of the most beautiful locations in Alaska. They wanted to hike. They wanted to see old-growth trees. They wanted to take photographs and experience the wilderness and return to their homes with stories about their adventure. They arrived during the middle of the governmental investigation into whether the 3 deaths constituted a pattern suggestive of systemic management failure. They arrived during the period when the northeastern sector remained officially open to the public despite mounting evidence that this was inappropriate. They arrived during the period when I was beginning to understand that my warnings to individuals could not prevent what was going to happen, and that I was being positioned in a role where I would eventually be forced to choose between maintaining my silence or betraying the systematic nature of the negligence. They asked me where the best hiking trails were. They asked me whether it was safe to venture into the remote areas. They asked me with the genuine friendliness of people who believed that I would give them honest answers, and that my role as a park ranger included a responsibility to direct them toward locations that were both beautiful and safe. I told them that the most accessible trails were in the southern sectors. I told them that those sectors offered comparable views to the northeastern locations. I told them that there were good reasons to prefer the southern regions, reasons that I could not fully explain but that I was asking them to trust. Scott Torres was the kind of man who believed that risk was acceptable if the reward was sufficiently significant. He had come to Alaska to see the most dramatic locations. He had researched the park and had identified the northeastern sector as the location that would provide the most aesthetically impressive experience. He had already decided where he wanted to go. He was simply hoping that I would provide him with logistical support rather than permission. I did not give him permission. I gave him the coordinates to the southern trails. I gave him maps and recommendations and warnings. I did everything I could do short of physically preventing him from accessing the location. I should have realized that I was only delaying what was inevitable. I should have understood that having finally decided to lose patience with the boundaries that had been established by my ancestors, the thing in the forest would simply wait until someone arrived who was willing to cross those boundaries voluntarily. Scott Torres and Pamela Peterson entered the northeastern sector at dawn on a Tuesday morning. I watched them from the ranger station. I watched the sign-in sheet. I watched the permits that had been filed in accordance with all appropriate regulations. I watched the evidence that they had crossed into the area and that there was no legal authority I possessed that could prevent it. I called my grandmother. I told her what had happened. I told her that I had failed in my responsibility as a keeper. I told her that I had not been strong enough to protect the boundary. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said that the boundary had been crossed when the bridge had been built. She said that I was not responsible for the failures of the generations before me. She said that what was about to happen was the consequence of collective decisions that had been made by people who did not understand that some boundaries existed because something old and patient lived behind them, and that patience has limits. The search for Scott Torres and Pamela Peterson began when they did not return from their hike. The search continued for 6 days. The search covered the entire northeastern sector and the surrounding regions. The search found no trace of either individual. The search found no equipment. The search found no remains. The search found no evidence that they had ever been in the forest at all, except for the sign-in sheet and the permit documentation that confirmed they had entered. What the search found instead was something that none of the official reports have explained or acknowledged. The search found an area of the forest where the trees had been arranged in a pattern. The trees had been moved. The trees had been positioned in a configuration that appeared to form a barrier or a boundary or a marker of some kind. The arrangement had not existed 3 days earlier, according to the most recent survey. The arrangement had been created during the period when Scott Torres and Pamela Peterson were missing. The arrangement pointed toward a location deeper in the forest. The arrangement suggested that something had made a statement. The arrangement suggested that something was demarcating territory in a manner that was visually unmistakable. The government closed the park the following week. The government announced that the closure was temporary, pending completion of a comprehensive investigation. The government has not reopened it. The government maintains that this has nothing to do with the pattern of deaths. The government maintains that the closure is unrelated to the territorial arrangement of trees or the professional opinions of multiple specialists that the arrangement could not have been created by natural forces. I submitted my resignation. I submitted it without explanation. I refused all requests for interviews. I returned to Ketchikan and took work at a hotel, which is less demanding and allows me to maintain a normal sleep schedule, even though the sleep does not come easily. I have been contacted by 3 different journalists. I have been contacted by 2 different attorneys. I have been contacted by a filmmaker who wants to create a documentary about the incidents. I have refused all of them, until now. I have refused all of them because speaking the truth in an official context feels like betrayal of the knowledge that my family holds. But the families of Gregory Rivera and Hannah Cooper and Frank Richardson and Martha Cox and Zachary Howard and Deborah Ward and Scott Torres and Pamela Peterson deserve answers. The families deserve to know that this was not accident or mismanagement or the random tragedy of wilderness exploration. The families deserve to know that the northeastern sector of Tongass National Forest is built on a boundary that was established long before the government arrived. The families deserve to know that something old and patient lives in those valleys, something that made an agreement with the Tlingit people hundreds of years ago, something that respected that agreement for generations, something that has recently decided that it is no longer willing to wait for humans to understand the limits of their own presence. My grandmother told me something else. She told me that in the old Tlingit stories, the creature in the forest is not an enemy. The creature is a keeper, the same way that my grandfather and my father were keepers. The creature maintains the boundary between the world that humans can inhabit and the world that belongs to the forest itself. The creature has no interest in harming humans, but it will defend its territory against incursion with absolute ferocity. The northeastern sector was never meant to be developed. The trails were never meant to exist. The bridges were never meant to be built. Every person who died in that location died because a boundary was crossed by people who did not understand that some knowledge exists precisely because crossing those boundaries results in death. This is what I needed to say. This is what the families needed to hear. This is the answer that the government will not provide. I do not expect the government to listen. I do not expect the park to remain closed. I expect that there will be another reopening and another series of incidents and more families discovering that the wilderness contains truths that permit systems and safety regulations cannot adequately address. What I hope is that someone hears this narrative and understands that the boundaries that indigenous people establish around locations exist because those locations have already taught us their cost in human lives. What I hope is that the Tlingit protocols will finally be respected not because they are aesthetically interesting but because respecting them is the only way to avoid the pattern of loss that will otherwise continue. The northeastern sector of Tongass National Forest belongs to what lives there. We do not belong in that location. We were told this by the oldest stories. We were warned by the death of 8 people in the span of 5 months. We were told in the silence of the birds and the arrangement of the trees and the absolute disappearance of 2 human beings from a location where the government assured visitors that they were safe. I am a keeper like my grandfather and my father before me. What I did not understand until too late was that being a keeper meant preventing people from entering places that the forest had already claimed. Being a keeper meant having the authority to say no and having the courage to enforce that word even when the government said yes. I failed in that responsibility. 8 people died because I did not have the strength to prevent their entry into the northeastern sector. 8 people died because the government will not listen to warnings that come from sources that cannot be quantified or measured or included in environmental assessments. This is my testimony. This is my attempt to transform failure into warning for the people who come after. This is my hope that somewhere, someone in a position of actual authority will read this narrative and understand that some boundaries exist because crossing them teaches lessons that kill the people who refuse to listen. The northeastern sector of Tongass National Forest is not safe. The northeastern sector is not a location for tourism or research or timber operations. The northeastern sector belongs to something that was here before us, and that will be here long after us, and that has decided that it will no longer tolerate human incursion beyond the boundaries that my ancestors established. Respect those boundaries. Stay out of the northeastern sector. Listen to the warnings that come from indigenous knowledge, not because they are culturally interesting, but because they are encoded with the observations of people who have spent generations learning what it means to live alongside things that do not want to harm us, but will do so absolutely if we prove that we cannot be taught to stay away. This is what I needed to say. This is what I should have said from the beginning. This is what I hope will prevent the next death, even though I fear it will not.